Dharma. Dharma is the ancient idea that your life has an inner alignment, a path that feels right not because it is easy, but because it is true. At its core, Dharma is about living in accordance with your nature, your responsibilities, and the unseen order that holds life together. When people speak of feeling lost, they are often describing a quiet separation from their Dharma, a sense that their actions no longer match who they are meant to be. This concept recognizes that not all lives are meant to look the same. Dharma does not demand perfection or constant happiness. It demands sincerity. It asks whether your choices are rooted in obligation, fear, or imitation, or whether they arise from a deeper sense of duty to your own role in the world. In this way, Dharma can feel heavy because it often requires sacrifice, discipline, and patience. It is easier to chase pleasure than to carry responsibility, yet Dharma insists that meaning comes from carrying what is yours to carry. Dharma also acknowledges conflict. You can feel torn between desire and duty, comfort and purpose, approval and truth. This tension is not a failure. It is the signal that Dharma is active. When you ignore it, life feels chaotic and hollow. When you align with it, even suffering gains structure. Pain becomes purposeful instead of random. Effort becomes grounding instead of draining, and identity feels earned rather than borrowed. Dharma is not about destiny handed down from above. It is about recognizing where you are needed, what you are capable of, and who you betray when you refuse to step into that role. Stoicism. Stoicism is the ancient discipline of learning where your power ends and where it does not begin. At its core, Stoicism teaches that most human suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the meanings we attach to them. Loss, rejection, delay, and pain are unavoidable, yet the inner collapse that follows them is optional. Stoicism exists to train that separation. This philosophy asks you to divide life into two domains: what you can control and what you cannot. Your thoughts, judgments, and actions belong to you. Other people's opinions, the past, chance, and outcomes do not. The moment you confuse these domains, anxiety takes root. The Stoic does not deny emotion. They study it. Anger, fear, and grief are signals, not commanders. You are allowed to feel them, but not to surrender your agency to them. Stoicism becomes powerful because it restores dignity in moments where people usually feel helpless. When insulted, ignored, or treated unfairly, Stoicism offers a quiet strength that refuses to hand over inner peace to external chaos. It replaces the need for validation with self-respect and the craving for control with clarity. This creates a strange freedom. When nothing outside you can truly harm your character, fear loses its grip. The discipline is demanding because it removes excuses. You cannot blame fate for your reactions or others for your inner state. Stoicism forces you to confront yourself honestly, especially in discomfort. Yet within that confrontation lies relief. When you stop arguing with reality, energy returns. Life becomes something you respond to deliberately rather than something that happens to you. Mat. Mat is the ancient principle that the world only holds together when truth, balance, and order are actively maintained. It is not a passive idea of justice. It is a living force that must be practiced daily or it begins to decay. In the concept of Mat, chaos is not an enemy that disappears once defeated. It is a constant pressure, waiting for lies, excess, and neglect to create cracks in reality. Mat teaches that truth is not merely spoken, it is lived. When words and actions drift apart, disorder spreads outward into families, communities, and institutions. This is why Mat links morality to the structure of the universe itself. Personal dishonesty is never just personal. Every broken promise, every abuse of power, every tolerated injustice quietly tilts the scales, even when no one is watching. What makes Ma'at emotionally powerful is its demand for responsibility without applause. Upholding balance often feels lonely because chaos is louder and easier. It is tempting to bend truth for comfort, to accept imbalance for convenience, to remain silent when correction is costly. Ma'at insists that these small compromises accumulate, and eventually the weight becomes unbearable. Under Ma'at, order is not maintained by force, but by integrity. Leaders fall not because they are attacked, but because they abandon balance. Societies collapse not from sudden disasters, but from the slow normalization of injustice. Ma'at places the burden of cosmic stability on everyday behavior, making each individual a quiet guardian of order. Living by Ma'at means choosing truth even when it costs you, restraint when excess is rewarded, and fairness when imbalance would benefit you. In this framework, justice is not delayed or outsourced. It is enacted moment by moment, or it is lost.
Tao.
Tao is the ancient understanding that life flows best when it is not forced. It describes the underlying current that moves through everything, the natural way events unfold when interference is minimal and awareness is present. Tao is not something to conquer or control. The moment you try to dominate it, you move against it. Most human frustration, from this perspective, comes from pushing where yielding would create movement. At the heart of Tao is the idea that resistance creates friction. When people obsess over control, certainty, and rigid plans, they exhaust themselves fighting realities that cannot be bent. Tao teaches that strength often looks like softness, and progress often comes from patience. Water becomes its symbol because it adapts without losing itself, reshaping stone not through force, but through persistence and timing. Emotionally, Tao speaks to the exhaustion of modern striving. The endless pressure to optimize, hustle, and prove worth creates inner tension that never resolves. Tao offers relief by reframing success as alignment rather than domination. When you act in harmony with circumstances instead of against them, effort feels lighter, and outcomes arrive with less resistance. This does not mean passivity or surrendering responsibility. Tao emphasizes Wu Wei, action without strain. It is the skill of knowing when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when silence carries more power. A forced action may succeed briefly, but it creates imbalance that demands correction later. Tao asks you to trust timing, to notice patterns instead of fighting them, and to recognize that life often moves forward sideways rather than straight ahead. When you stop gripping outcomes too tightly, clarity emerges. Decisions become intuitive rather than anxious, and progress feels natural instead of draining, as if you are finally moving with the current rather than swimming against it. Arete. Arete is the ancient belief that a human being is meant to be fully realized, not merely successful. It speaks to the quiet drive to become excellent in character, action, and purpose, regardless of recognition or reward. Arete is not about winning, outperforming others, or chasing status. It is about fulfilling your potential so completely that your actions reflect who you truly are at your best. This concept reframes effort as a form of respect for life itself. To act with Arete is to refuse mediocrity, not out of arrogance, but out of responsibility. When you cut corners, act lazily, or betray your own standards, the damage is internal before it is external. Arete recognizes that the deepest form of failure is self-betrayal, the slow erosion of integrity that happens when you settle for less than you are capable of becoming. Emotionally, Arete confronts the discomfort of discipline. Growth is rarely glamorous. It requires repetition, humility, and the willingness to be unseen while improving. In a world obsessed with outcomes, Arete shifts focus to the quality of effort. Excellence becomes a daily practice, not a distant achievement. This makes every action meaningful, even when no one is watching. Arete also rejects the idea that talent excuses weakness of character. Skill without virtue is incomplete. Intelligence without restraint becomes destructive. Strength without wisdom collapses under pressure. Arete demands balance, insisting that ability and ethics rise together. Living by Arete means holding yourself to a higher standard than the world demands of you. It means choosing mastery over shortcuts, depth over applause, and consistency over intensity. Over time, this commitment reshapes identity itself. You do not merely perform excellently. You become someone for whom excellence is natural, inevitable, and quietly uncompromising. Karma. Karma is the ancient recognition that nothing you do truly disappears. Every action, word, and intention leaves a residue, shaping the direction of your life in ways that are often invisible at first. It is not a system of instant reward or punishment, but a slow, accumulating force that turns patterns into destiny. What you repeat, you reinforce. What you tolerate, you invite. At its core, karma shifts responsibility inward. It removes the comfort of believing that life is random, or that outcomes are purely the result of luck or injustice. Karma suggests that much of what surrounds you now is the echo of choices made earlier, sometimes consciously, sometimes out of fear, habit, or ignorance. This can feel unsettling because it means you cannot fully escape yourself. Emotionally, karma explains why certain cycles repeat no matter how much scenery changes. New jobs, new relationships, new environments, yet the same conflicts resurface. Karma operates through patterns of behavior and mindset, not through moral bookkeeping. If resentment guides your decisions, resentment finds you again. If integrity shapes your actions, stability slowly forms around you. Karma is especially powerful because it works even when no one is watching. You cannot negotiate with it, justify yourself to it, or hide from it. Intent matters as much as action, because intention determines direction. Small compromises accumulate just as quietly as small acts of discipline. Understanding karma creates a sharp awareness of the present moment. Every response becomes a seed. Every decision bends the future slightly. Whether that future hardens or heals depends less on fate and more on what you consistently choose to embody right now. Logos. Logos is the ancient belief that beneath chaos, emotion, and randomness, there exists an intelligible order. It is the idea that reality is not merely a sequence of accidents, but something that can be understood, reasoned with, and spoken into coherence. Logos represents the principle that meaning is discovered through clarity, logic, and truthful articulation rather than impulse or myth alone. At an emotional level, Logos confronts the fear that life is senseless. When events feel overwhelming or unjust, the mind searches for structure. Logos offers the reassurance that understanding is possible, even if it is incomplete. It does not promise comfort, but it promises orientation. Through reasoned thought and honest language, confusion becomes navigable rather than paralyzing. Logos also emphasizes the power of speech. Words are not neutral under this concept. They shape perception, influence action, and build or destroy order. When language is precise and truthful, it stabilizes both the individual and the community. When language is corrupted, exaggerated, or weaponized, disorder spreads. This is why Logos connects rational thinking with ethical responsibility. To speak falsely is not just to lie, but to fracture reality. Emotionally, Logos demands discipline. It asks you to pause before reacting, to examine beliefs before defending them, and to resist narratives that feel good but collapse under scrutiny. This can feel uncomfortable because Logos removes the safety of illusion. Yet within that discomfort lies empowerment. When you understand how things work, fear loses its edge. Logos does not eliminate emotion. It gives emotion a framework. Passion without structure becomes chaos, but reason without humanity becomes sterile. Logos exists at the intersection, where clarity tempers feeling and truth prevents meaning from dissolving into noise.
Yin and Yang.
Yin and Yang is the ancient realization that life is not divided into good and bad, but into forces that need each other to exist. It teaches that opposites are not enemies. They are partners locked in constant exchange. Light depends on darkness to be visible. Strength only matters because weakness exists. Stillness gives meaning to motion. When one force tries to dominate completely, imbalance follows. This concept challenges the instinct to eliminate discomfort. Modern thinking often frames pain, fear, and uncertainty as problems to be erased. Yin and Yang reveals that removing one side of the equation creates fragility, not peace. A life made only of pleasure becomes shallow. A world obsessed with productivity collapses without rest. Suppressing vulnerability eventually weakens strength rather than protecting it. Emotionally, Yin and Yang speaks to inner conflict. People often feel broken because they carry contradictions, ambition mixed with doubt, confidence shadowed by fear, logic entangled with emotion. Yin and Yang reframes this as natural rather than flawed. Wholeness is not purity, it is balance. Growth comes from allowing opposing forces to inform each other instead of silencing one side. The symbol itself carries a warning. Each side contains a seed of the other, reminding us that extremes always give birth to their opposite. Excessive control breeds chaos. Endless softness invites collapse. Stability lives in adjustment, not rigidity. Applied to life, Yin and Yang teaches timing. Knowing when to push and when to yield, when to speak and when silence carries more weight. It encourages responsiveness rather than stubbornness. When you stop forcing one version of yourself to dominate, energy returns. Decisions become more grounded, emotions less volatile, and life feels dynamic rather than exhausting, as if balance is not something you reach once, but something you continuously maintain. Hubris. Hubris is the ancient warning against forgetting your limits. It describes the moment confidence hardens into arrogance and self-belief turns into the illusion of invincibility. Hubris is not loud at first. It begins quietly when success goes unexamined and power stops being questioned. Over time, it convinces individuals and societies that the rules no longer apply to them. At its core, hubris is a blindness to consequence. When people believe they are exceptional, they stop listening, stop adapting, and stop respecting forces larger than themselves. This creates a dangerous gap between perception and reality. Mistakes are dismissed, warnings are ignored, and criticism is reframed as envy or weakness. Hubris thrives in echo chambers, where praise replaces truth and confidence is mistaken for wisdom. Emotionally, hubris feeds on fear. The fear of losing status, relevance, or control pushes people to overreach. Instead of humility, they double down. Instead of correction, they escalate. This is why hubris so often precedes collapse, not because fate punishes pride, but because arrogance disables learning, and without learning, decay becomes inevitable. Hubris also distorts identity. People begin to define themselves by dominance rather than competence, image rather than substance. They confuse being admired with being right. This separation from reality creates fragility disguised as strength. The ancient warning embedded in hubris is not against ambition, but against forgetting dependence. Every success rests on unseen systems, other people, timing, and chance. When that truth is denied, judgment weakens. And when judgment weakens, downfall no longer arrives as a surprise, but as a delayed certainty that was visible long before it happened. Ananke. Ananke is the ancient recognition that not everything bends to will, effort, or desire. It represents necessity, inevitability, and the hard limits placed on human freedom. Where hope promises possibility, Ananke introduces constraint. It reminds you that some outcomes arrive regardless of preparation, virtue, or resistance, and that denial of this truth often deepens suffering rather than preventing it. Emotionally, Ananke confronts the discomfort of powerlessness. People want to believe that discipline, intelligence, or morality guarantee control over life's direction. Ananke strips away that illusion. Illness, loss, aging, and death exist outside negotiation. Certain moments cannot be avoided, only faced. This realization can feel crushing, yet it also carries a strange relief. When inevitability is acknowledged, the exhausting struggle against reality begins to loosen. Ananke does not erase choice. It defines its boundaries. Within constraint, character is revealed. You may not choose the event, but you choose how you meet it. This is where Ananke intersects with dignity. The refusal to collapse internally, even when escape is impossible, becomes a form of quiet strength. Acceptance here is not surrender, but clarity. This concept also exposes the danger of blaming oneself for what could never have been changed. Guilt often thrives on the fantasy that control was possible. Ananke dissolves that fantasy. It teaches discernment between responsibility and fate, action and acceptance. Living with Ananke means understanding that freedom is not unlimited motion, but intelligent movement within limits. When necessity is respected rather than resisted, energy returns. You stop asking why reality should be different and begin asking who you will be within it. Ataraxia. Ataraxia is the ancient pursuit of inner stillness in a world that constantly pulls at the nervous system. It describes a state of unshaken calm, not because life is gentle, but because the mind no longer panics in response to uncertainty. Ataraxia is not numbness or indifference. It is emotional clarity without turbulence. This concept begins with the recognition that most anxiety is manufactured internally. Fear often arises not from what is happening, but from imagined futures, distorted expectations, and the constant need for reassurance. Ataraxia trains the mind to stop feeding these loops. When you reduce unnecessary desires and detach from outcomes you cannot control, emotional noise fades. What remains is a quiet awareness that allows you to respond rather than react. Emotionally, ataraxia is powerful because it offers relief without escapism. Instead of chasing constant stimulation or validation, it teaches satisfaction through simplicity. Peace becomes something cultivated, not something postponed until life improves. This challenges the belief that calm is earned only after success, security, or approval. Ataraxia insists that waiting for perfect conditions keeps you permanently restless. The discipline behind ataraxia is subtle but demanding. It requires examining beliefs that disturb you and questioning whether they are necessary. Many fears lose their power once they are seen clearly. When the mind stops exaggerating threats, the body follows. Breathing slows, tension releases, and attention returns to the present moment. Ataraxia does not remove pain from life, but it prevents pain from multiplying itself through resistance. Loss still hurts, uncertainty still exists, and effort is still required. What changes is the absence of inner chaos. In that stillness, judgment sharpens, emotions settle, and life becomes manageable without becoming dull. Nomos. Nomos is the ancient recognition that much of human behavior is shaped not by nature, but by agreement. It represents the invisible rules, customs, and laws that quietly dictate what feels normal, acceptable, or unthinkable within a society. Nomos explains why people raised in different cultures can experience the same act as moral, shameful, or meaningless. What feels natural is often learned so deeply it no longer feels learned at all. At its core, Nomos reveals how powerful collective belief can be. Once rules are repeated long enough, they stop feeling like choices and begin to feel like reality. People obey not because force is present, but because deviation threatens belonging. This is why breaking social norms triggers discomfort even when no harm is caused. The fear is not punishment, it is exclusion. Emotionally, Nomos governs identity. It tells you who you are allowed to be, what success looks like, how love should function, and which paths are respectable. When someone feels trapped or misaligned, they are often struggling against a Nomos that no longer fits them. Yet questioning it feels dangerous because Nomos offers safety through predictability. Nomos can stabilize societies, but it can also imprison them. Harmful traditions survive not because they are logical, but because they are familiar. When Nomos becomes rigid, it punishes innovation and rewards conformity even when change is necessary for survival. Understanding Nomos creates a quiet awakening. You begin to notice how many of your beliefs were inherited rather than chosen. Some rules protect life, others simply preserve power. The moment you see the difference, obedience becomes a decision rather than a reflex, and identity becomes something you negotiate consciously instead of something handed to you without consent. Tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is the ancient proposition that the human mind begins as a blank surface, shaped not by destiny alone, but by experience, environment, and repetition. It challenges the comforting belief that people are fixed, born fully formed in their virtues or flaws. Instead, it suggests that identity is written slowly, line by line, through what we witness, endure, and internalize. Emotionally, this idea is unsettling because it removes the refuge of inevitability. If you are shaped, then you are also vulnerable. Harm leaves marks. Neglect writes itself deeply, but this same vulnerability carries hope. If the mind is written, it can also be rewritten. Tabula rasa explains why early experiences echo so loudly in adult behavior, why patterns repeat even when they are painful, and why healing feels like learning a new language rather than flipping a switch. This concept exposes the quiet power of influence. Words spoken in childhood, expectations placed by authority, and repeated emotional environments do not disappear. They accumulate, forming instincts that feel natural but are learned. Tabula rasa forces a confrontation with responsibility, not just for oneself, but for how one shapes others. Every interaction becomes an inscription, whether intentional or careless. There is discomfort in realizing how much of the self is inherited through exposure rather than choice. Yet there is liberation in understanding that identity is not a prison. Awareness creates distance between the writer and the text. Habits can be examined, beliefs can be questioned, reactions can be retrained. Tabula rasa does not deny temperament or biology. It highlights malleability. It reveals that growth is not about discovering a hidden true self, but about consciously choosing what deserves to remain written and what must be erased, rewritten, or finally understood. Eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is the ancient understanding that a good life is not measured by pleasure, comfort, or momentary happiness, but by deep fulfillment over time. It points to a state of living well rather than feeling good, where meaning arises from growth, contribution, and alignment with values. Eudaimonia challenges the modern obsession with chasing happiness as if it were a permanent emotional high. This concept recognizes that pleasure is fleeting and unreliable. Comfort fades quickly, and excitement always demands more. Eudaimonia instead focuses on the kind of life that can withstand hardship without losing its worth. It asks whether your days add up to something coherent, whether your actions build character, and whether your efforts serve something beyond immediate gratification. Emotionally, Eudaimonia speaks to the quiet dissatisfaction people feel even when their lives look successful from the outside. Achievements without meaning create emptiness. Eudaimonia explains why fulfillment often comes from difficult paths, from responsibility, discipline, and long-term commitment rather than ease. Struggle becomes meaningful when it contributes to growth instead of avoidance. Eudaimonia also reframes suffering. Pain is not automatically negative. It becomes destructive only when it is disconnected from purpose. When effort is tied to values, hardship strengthens rather than erodes. This is why a meaningful life can feel heavy yet satisfying, while a comfortable life can feel hollow. Living with eudaimonia means prioritizing who you are becoming over what you are accumulating. It shifts focus from outcomes to character, from approval to integrity. The reward is not constant joy, but a stable sense that your life makes sense, even when it is difficult, even when it demands sacrifice, and even when happiness temporarily fades. Samsara. Samsara is the ancient insight that suffering often comes from repetition rather than catastrophe. It describes the endless cycle of craving, dissatisfaction, and temporary relief that defines much of human life. Desire arises, pursuit follows, satisfaction arrives briefly, and then emptiness returns, demanding something new. Samsara is not a punishment imposed from outside. It is a loop sustained from within. At its core, samsara explains why fulfillment feels fleeting. The mind is constantly reaching forward, convinced that the next achievement, relationship, or possession will finally bring rest. When it does not, the failure is blamed on circumstance rather than on the pattern itself. Samsara survives because hope keeps the cycle moving, even when experience contradicts it. Emotionally, samsara feels exhausting. It is the quiet burnout of always wanting, always chasing, and never arriving. Pleasure becomes a distraction rather than nourishment, and identity becomes tied to consumption and comparison. The more tightly you grip what you want, the more fragile your peace becomes. Samsara also operates through habit. Reactions repeat because awareness is absent. Anger follows insult. Fear follows uncertainty. Attachment follows pleasure. Without reflection, these responses harden into identity, making change feel impossible. The loop continues not because people choose it consciously, but because they do not see it clearly. The power of samsara lies in its subtlety. Nothing dramatic is required to remain trapped. Ordinary days are enough. Recognition is what weakens it. The moment you notice the pattern instead of obeying it, space appears. Desire loses some of its authority, repetition loosens, and the possibility of stepping out of the cycle becomes imaginable. Telos. Telos is the ancient idea that everything moves toward an end, a purpose that gives direction to effort and meaning to struggle. It suggests that actions are not random motions, but steps aimed, consciously or not, towards some final aim. When people feel restless or empty, Telos frames that discomfort as a signal that movement has lost direction, not that life has lost value. Emotionally, Telos speaks to the ache of drifting. Without a sense of purpose, effort becomes exhausting, and success feels hollow. Achievements pile up, yet satisfaction never arrives because the question of for what remains unanswered. Telos insists that fulfillment does not come from motion alone, but from motion aligned with an end that matters. It is not about speed, but orientation. This concept also introduces tension. Purpose demands sacrifice. When Telos is clear, certain paths must be refused, even if they are tempting or socially rewarded. This refusal can feel isolating because purpose often separates rather than unites. It forces you to confront distractions, habits, and roles that keep you busy but directionless. Telos does not require grand ambition. A purpose can be quiet, relational, or internal. What matters is coherence, the feeling that daily actions contribute to something beyond immediate comfort. When telos is absent, motivation collapses into anxiety or numbness. When it is present, effort gains resilience. Obstacles become tests rather than signs to quit. This idea also exposes the danger of borrowed purpose. Goals inherited from culture, family, or fear can mimic telos without fulfilling it. True telos creates integration rather than tension, pulling thought, behavior, and identity into alignment. When actions point toward an authentic end, even difficulty feels justified and time itself feels less wasted, as if each step belongs where it is going.
Apeiron.
Apeiron is the ancient idea that beneath everything we can name, measure, and understand lies something boundless, undefined, and unknowable. It represents the infinite source from which all things emerge and to which they eventually return. Apeiron challenges the human need for certainty by reminding us that reality does not begin with clarity, but with mystery. This concept confronts the discomfort of not knowing. Humans instinctively seek structure, explanations, and borders because uncertainty feels threatening. Apeiron exposes how much of life exists outside those boundaries. No matter how advanced knowledge becomes, there is always an edge where definitions dissolve. Apeiron lives at that edge, where control ends and humility begins. Emotionally, Apeiron resonates with existential anxiety, the fear that life has no fixed blueprint, that meaning is not guaranteed, and that the universe does not revolve around human intention. Instead of offering comfort, Apeiron offers honesty. It teaches that insecurity is not a flaw in existence, but a fundamental condition of it. The chaos people try to escape is not external. It is woven into reality itself. Yet within this boundlessness lies creative power. Apeiron is not emptiness. It is potential. From the undefined, new forms arise. Innovation, transformation, and becoming are possible only because reality is not fully closed or finished. When everything is predetermined, nothing new can emerge. Living with awareness of Apeiron reshapes how you face uncertainty. Rather than demanding absolute answers, you learn to stand at the edge without collapsing. You stop mistaking control for safety and certainty for truth. Meaning becomes something you participate in rather than something handed to you. Apeiron does not promise stability, but it offers freedom from illusion, teaching that growth begins where certainty breaks down and the unknown is allowed to exist. Mimesis. Mimesis is the ancient recognition that humans learn who to be by watching others. It describes the deep instinct to imitate behavior, desire, and identity long before conscious choice appears. From early childhood, people absorb gestures, values, ambitions, and fears simply by being surrounded by them. What feels like personal preference is often borrowed without notice. At its core, Mimesis explains why desire spreads. People do not want objects or status in isolation. They want what they see others wanting. This creates invisible competition, where value is assigned not by need, but by imitation. Mimesis turns comparison into a constant background noise, shaping self-worth through reflection rather than introspection. Emotionally, mimesis can be destabilizing. When identity is built from imitation, fulfillment depends on external validation. People chase lives that were never meant for them, mistaking visibility for meaning. This leads to quiet dissatisfaction, because imitation can copy appearance but not alignment. You can mirror someone's success and still feel empty inside it. Mimesis also explains conflict. When multiple people imitate the same desires, rivalry forms. Resentment grows not from difference but from similarity. The closer two people mirror each other's ambitions, the more intense the tension becomes. Competition feels personal because it threatens identity itself. Yet, mimesis is not purely destructive. It is also how wisdom spreads. Discipline, courage, compassion, and integrity are learned through example before they are understood intellectually. Awareness is the key difference. When mimesis is unconscious, it traps. When it is conscious, it becomes selective. You begin choosing who to learn from, what to mirror, and which desires no longer deserve imitation. Fate and free will. Fate and free will exist in constant tension, pulling the human mind between inevitability and choice. Fate suggests that certain events are fixed, woven into life regardless of intention or effort. Free will insists that agency remains, that decisions matter, and identity is shaped through choice. This conflict is not meant to be resolved. It is meant to be lived inside. Emotionally, this tension explains why people oscillate between guilt and resignation. When things go wrong, the mind searches for control, replaying choices as if perfection could have prevented loss. When things go well, fate is often credited, easing the burden of responsibility. Fate and free will together expose how desperately humans want meaning without blame and freedom without consequence. This concept forces a confrontation with uncertainty. If everything is fate, effort feels pointless. If everything is free will, failure feels unbearable. The psychological weight comes from standing between these extremes. You choose, but not from infinite options. You act, but within conditions you did not create. This reality is uncomfortable because it denies clean explanations. Fate provides structure to chaos, a narrative that suffering is not meaningless. Free will preserves dignity, the belief that character is forged through response. One without the other collapses. Fate without agency becomes fatalism. Freedom without limits becomes anxiety. What grips people emotionally is the realization that responsibility does not require total control. You are accountable for your choices, not for every outcome. This distinction is rarely taught, but deeply necessary. When you accept that life is partly written and partly authored, self-blame softens without dissolving commitment. Living inside this tension means acting fully while releasing obsession with results. It means choosing with integrity even when outcomes remain uncertain. Fate sets the stage, free will delivers the performance, and meaning emerges in how you play the role you did not choose but must still inhabit. The golden mean. The golden mean is the ancient principle that a good life is built through balance, not extremes. It teaches that virtue exists in the space between excess and deficiency, where action is measured, intentional, and grounded in reason. Rather than demanding constant restraint or relentless intensity, the golden mean asks for calibration, the ability to adjust behavior to the moment without losing direction. This concept confronts a deeply human pattern, swinging from one extreme to another in search of certainty. When afraid, people over-control. When exhausted, they overindulge. When seeking meaning, they attach themselves to rigid identities. The golden mean reveals how these oscillations create instability. Extremes feel decisive, but they are fragile. Balance, though quieter, endures. Emotionally, the golden mean challenges the belief that more is always better. More ambition can become obsession. More confidence can harden into arrogance. More caution can dissolve into fear. The golden mean teaches discernment, the skill of knowing when a trait strengthens you and when it begins to distort you. This awareness creates inner steadiness, replacing emotional whiplash with continuity. The discipline behind the golden mean is subtle because it resists simple rules. What is balanced for one person or moment may be excessive for another. This requires attention, reflection, and honesty. You must notice when your reactions are driven by impulse rather than intention, when desire pulls you beyond what is sustainable. Living by the golden mean means choosing proportion over intensity and longevity over bursts of effort. It reframes virtue as adaptability rather than rigidity. When you stop chasing extremes, life becomes less volatile, decisions feel clearer, emotions less consuming, and progress more consistent, as if stability itself becomes a quiet form of strength that holds even under pressure. Rua Terracina. Arta is the ancient understanding that reality is held together by an underlying order that governs both the natural world and human behavior. It represents the principle that the same rhythm guiding the stars, seasons, and cycles of life also applies to truth, ethics, and action. When things feel chaotic, Arta suggests that something has fallen out of alignment rather than broken randomly. At its core, Arta links morality to structure. Actions are not isolated events. They either support or disrupt the coherence of the whole. Truth stabilizes, deception destabilizes, restraint preserves, excess corrodes. Arete frames ethics not as rules imposed by authority, but as responses that either harmonize with reality or strain against it. When societies drift into disorder, Arta would argue it is because alignment has been ignored for too long. Emotionally, Arta speaks to the human craving for meaning in suffering. It suggests that chaos is not proof of meaninglessness, but evidence of imbalance. When people feel lost, exhausted, or disoriented, Arta points toward misalignment between action and order. This idea can be unsettling because it removes the comfort of randomness and replaces it with responsibility. Arete also explains why injustice feels heavier than mere harm. When truth is violated, something deeper than fairness is disrupted. Trust collapses, continuity fractures, and people feel unmoored. The damage is structural, not just personal. Living in accordance with Arta means acting as if your choices echo beyond immediate outcomes. It requires awareness that integrity is not optional decoration, but load-bearing. When alignment is maintained, life feels coherent. When it is ignored, even success feels unstable, as if it rests on ground that can no longer hold. Mythos. Mythos is the ancient understanding that humans do not live by facts alone, but by stories that give those facts meaning. It represents the narrative layer of reality, the symbolic frameworks through which people interpret suffering, identity, morality, and hope. Long before data and logic organized the world, Mythos explained why things mattered, not just how they happened. Emotionally, Mythos addresses a hunger that reason cannot satisfy. People can know the truth of a situation and still feel lost within it. Mythos fills that gap by turning experience into story, pain into trial, and uncertainty into purpose. This is why myths persist even when they are no longer believed literally. They survive because they speak to psychological truths rather than historical ones. Mythos shapes identity by offering roles to inhabit: hero, victim, exile, chosen one, betrayer. These archetypes quietly guide behavior, often without awareness. When someone feels stuck, they are often trapped in a story they did not consciously choose. Mythos reveals that suffering intensifies when it lacks narrative, when events feel random instead of meaningful. This concept also exposes the power and danger of stories. A shared myth can unite people, stabilize values, and give endurance during hardship. But distorted myths can justify cruelty, blind loyalty, and self-deception. Mythos does not ask whether a story is comforting, but whether it is orienting. A false myth can feel good while slowly destroying clarity. Emotionally, Mythos explains why people defend beliefs with such intensity. Attacking a myth feels like attacking identity itself. When a story collapses, disorientation follows. Meaning evaporates before a new narrative forms. Mythos reminds us that humans are not only thinkers, but storytellers, constantly translating experience into symbols to survive it. Whether consciously or not, Every life follows a mythic structure. Understanding mythos means recognizing the stories you live inside, questioning who wrote them, and sensing when a narrative no longer serves truth but merely protects fear. Paideia. Paideia is the ancient belief that education is not meant to fill the mind with information, but to shape the entire human being. It is the process of forming character, judgment, and identity, not just transferring knowledge. Paideia assumes that how a person thinks, acts, and relates to others matters more than how much they can recall or recite. This concept challenges the idea that learning is neutral. Every form of education carries values, whether acknowledged or not. Paideia recognizes that what a society teaches reveals what it worships. Skills without ethics create efficiency without wisdom. Intelligence without moral grounding becomes dangerous. Paideia insists that learning must cultivate responsibility alongside capability. Emotionally, Paideia speaks to the emptiness of achievement without depth. Many people succeed academically or professionally, yet feel unformed internally. Paideia explains this dissonance. When education neglects character, people grow competent but unstable, informed but directionless. True formation requires exposure to challenge, discipline, and ideals that demand reflection rather than memorization. Paideia also emphasizes imitation and example. Values are absorbed not through lectures, but through modeled behavior. Who you learn from shapes who you become. This makes education relational and moral, not mechanical. The teacher is not just a source of information, but a living reference point for conduct and judgment. Living within Paideia means treating growth as a lifelong process of refinement. It reframes learning as self-construction rather than credential accumulation. Each experience becomes formative, every choice educational. Over time, this creates individuals who are not only skilled, but grounded, capable of thought without confusion, action without recklessness, and leadership without emptiness. Asceticism. Asceticism is the ancient practice of voluntarily limiting pleasure in order to regain control over the self. It is not rooted in hatred of the body or rejection of life, but in the understanding that unchecked desire quietly takes power away from awareness. Asceticism emerges wherever people notice that comfort, when constant, dulls clarity and weakens will. At its core, asceticism challenges the assumption that more always leads to better. By intentionally saying no to excess, the practitioner confronts impulses that normally go unquestioned. Hunger, boredom, lust, and restlessness surface, revealing how much behavior is driven by avoidance rather than choice. This exposure can be uncomfortable, which is precisely the point. Asceticism turns discomfort into information. Emotionally, asceticism creates a sharp contrast between want and need. When stimulation is reduced, sensitivity returns. Small experiences regain intensity, and attention becomes less scattered. The constant noise of craving softens, making space for reflection and discipline. This is why ascetic practices appear across cultures during times of confusion or moral decay. They offer a way to reset when indulgence has blurred priorities. Asceticism also redefines strength. Power is no longer measured by accumulation or dominance, but by restraint. The ability to refuse what is available becomes a form of freedom. Those who cannot say no are ruled, even if they appear comfortable. This practice does not demand permanent withdrawal. It functions as a tool, not a lifestyle mandate. Periodic renunciation restores perspective, reminding the individual that identity does not depend on consumption. When desire loses its urgency, choice becomes deliberate, and life begins to feel directed rather than reactive. Hamartia. Hamartia is the ancient recognition that downfall rarely comes from evil intent, but from a small internal misalignment that goes unexamined. Often translated as a tragic flaw, Hamartia is not a dramatic vice or obvious weakness. It is a subtle blind spot, a habitual way of thinking or reacting that feels justified, even virtuous, until it quietly shapes destruction. Emotionally, Hamartia is unsettling because it mirrors how people experience failure in real life. Most collapses do not feel like sudden mistakes. They feel logical in the moment. Confidence becomes arrogance. Loyalty becomes stubbornness. Strength turns into rigidity. Hamartia reveals how virtues, when unchecked, can become liabilities. The tragedy is not ignorance, but certainty. This concept exposes why warnings are often ignored. Hamartia narrows perception. The individual becomes increasingly convinced that their perspective is correct, filtering out information that threatens identity or self-image. Correction feels like attack, and reflection feels unnecessary. By the time consequences appear, the flaw has already reshaped the path beyond reversal. What makes Hamartia emotionally powerful is its intimacy. It does not come from enemies or chance, but from the self. This creates a specific kind of regret, not over what was done, but over what was refused to be seen. The pain is sharpened by the realization that disaster grew from something once trusted. Hamartia is not a condemnation. It is a warning. It suggests that self-awareness is not optional, especially in moments of confidence. Growth requires suspicion of one's own certainty. The most dangerous flaws are not the ones you hate, but the ones you defend. In this way, Hamartia teaches that tragedy is rarely caused by fate alone. It is co-authored by unexamined identity, by traits left unbalanced, and by the quiet decision to stop questioning oneself just when questioning is needed most. Catharsis. Catharsis is the ancient recognition that emotions must be released, or they will quietly rot inside the psyche. It describes the process of purging built-up fear, grief, anger, and tension through expression, allowing the inner system to reset. Catharsis assumes that suppressing emotion does not create strength. It creates pressure, and pressure eventually demands an outlet. This concept emerged from the observation that humans carry emotional weight far longer than they realize. Unexpressed pain does not disappear, it hardens. Over time, it distorts perception, fuels reactivity, and leaks out in moments that seem disproportionate to the situation. Catharsis explains why people break down unexpectedly, lash out without clarity, or feel exhausted without knowing why. Emotionally, catharsis is powerful because it legitimizes vulnerability. It allows intense feeling without shame, whether through storytelling, art, ritual, movement, or shared experience. Catharsis gives shape to what is otherwise overwhelming. By witnessing emotion rather than resisting it, the mind regains coherence. The chaos becomes contained. Catharsis also creates connection. When emotions are expressed collectively, people recognize themselves in one another. This shared release dissolves isolation and restores a sense of belonging. Pain becomes communal rather than private, making it lighter to carry. This is why stories, music, and performance have always been tools for emotional survival, not entertainment alone. Catharsis does not mean indulging emotion endlessly or losing control. It is a temporary opening that allows tension to pass through instead of lodging permanently. After release comes clarity. Judgment sharpens, the body relaxes, and energy returns. Without catharsis, emotional life becomes stagnant. With it, feeling regains its natural rhythm, moving freely instead of accumulating silently until it explodes. Sacred time. Sacred time is the ancient understanding that not all moments are equal. It separates ordinary, repetitive time from moments that carry weight, meaning, and transformation. While daily life moves in routines and schedules, sacred time interrupts this flow, creating pauses where attention sharpens and existence feels significant rather than mechanical. At its core, sacred time explains why rituals, ceremonies, and milestones exist across all cultures. Births, initiations, marriages, mourning, and seasonal rites mark moments that demand presence. These events pull people out of automatic living and force them to acknowledge transition. Without sacred time, life becomes a blur of tasks with no emotional punctuation, and identity slowly erodes into function. Emotionally, sacred time anchors memory. Moments treated as sacred are remembered more vividly because they are felt more deeply. They create psychological landmarks that help people orient themselves during chaos or loss. When everything is treated as equally urgent, nothing feels meaningful. Sacred time restores hierarchy to experience. This concept also explains the discomfort people feel when rituals disappear. When transitions are rushed or ignored, grief lingers, growth feels incomplete, and closure never fully arrives. Sacred time gives structure to emotion, allowing people to process change without being overwhelmed by it. Sacred time does not require religion to function. Any moment intentionally set apart can become sacred through attention and meaning. Silence, reflection, collective focus, or repeated gestures can all open this space. What matters is the suspension of normal urgency. In that suspension, people reconnect with purpose, continuity, and belonging, feeling themselves part of something larger than routine survival. Totemism. Totemism is the ancient idea that identity is anchored in symbols that stand outside the individual, yet define who they are. A totem is not merely an object or animal. It is a mirror through which a group or person understands their place in the world. By identifying with something larger, older, or more powerful than themselves, people stabilize their sense of belonging and meaning. Emotionally, totemism speaks to the fear of isolation. Humans are not designed to exist as detached individuals. Totems provide continuity, linking the present self to ancestors, values, and shared memory. When identity feels fragile, the symbol becomes a psychological anchor. It says, "You are part of something that existed before you and will continue after you." This concept explains why symbols carry such emotional weight. Flags, logos, mascots, and emblems provoke pride, loyalty, and rage because they are not seen as representations, but as extensions of the self. An attack on the symbol feels like an attack on identity. Totemism reveals why people defend images more fiercely than ideas, and why belonging can override reason. Totemism also carries danger. When identity is outsourced entirely to a symbol, individuality collapses into conformity. Critical thinking gives way to devotion. The symbol becomes sacred, and questioning it feels like betrayal. This is how unity hardens into tribalism, and shared meaning turns into exclusion. At its core, totemism shows that humans need symbols to survive psychologically. Meaning becomes tangible through representation, but the symbol must remain a guide, not a master. When the totem is remembered as symbolic, it strengthens identity. When it is treated as absolute, it replaces thought with loyalty. Totemism reveals how deeply humans rely on external markers to know who they are, and how easily those markers can either ground identity or consume it entirely. Oikos. Oikos is the ancient understanding that life is sustained not by individuals in isolation, but by the systems that quietly support them. It refers to the household as the fundamental unit of society, the place where resources are managed, values are transmitted, and survival is coordinated. Oikos reveals that economy, ecology, and social stability all begin at home, long before they appear on a larger scale. This concept challenges the illusion of self-sufficiency. Every person depends on networks of care, labor, and shared responsibility, whether acknowledged or not. When oikos functions well, life feels stable and predictable. When it breaks down, anxiety spreads outward. Disorder at the foundational level eventually manifests as social and economic crisis. Emotionally, oikos speaks to the longing for belonging and security. A functional household provides more than shelter. It creates rhythm, trust, and continuity. It is where effort feels meaningful because it sustains others, not just the self. When oikos is neglected, people experience a diffuse sense of instability, even if material needs are met. Comfort without structure leaves an emotional void. Oikos also emphasizes stewardship. Resources are not meant to be exploited recklessly, but maintained for continuity. Waste, neglect, and imbalance within the household ripple outward into larger systems. This principle extends beyond family to communities, institutions, and environments. How you manage what is under your care reflects how you treat the world. Living by oikos means recognizing responsibility at the smallest scale. Daily routines, shared spaces, and mutual obligations matter more than abstract ideals. Order begins where people eat, sleep, work, and relate. When the household is grounded in care and balance, life stabilizes from the inside out, creating resilience that no external system can replace. Pietas. Pietas is the ancient sense of duty that binds a person to family, community, tradition, and responsibility beyond personal desire. It is not about blind obedience or emotional warmth, but about honoring what made your life possible. Pietas asks whether you recognize the debts you did not choose but still carry. At its core, Pietas defines identity as relational. You are not self-made, no matter how independent you feel. Language, protection, opportunity, and survival were inherited before they were earned. Pietas turns gratitude into action, insisting that loyalty is proven through consistency, sacrifice, and restraint rather than words. Emotionally, Pietas creates tension between freedom and obligation. Modern instincts favor self-expression and personal fulfillment, while Pietas demands continuity and preservation. This tension can feel suffocating, yet it also provides stability. Without pietas, bonds weaken and individuals drift, untethered from anything lasting. With it, life gains structure, even when choices are difficult. Pietas also restrains ego. It reminds people that their lives are chapters in a longer story, not the entire book. Decisions are weighed not only by personal benefit, but by their impact on those who came before and those who will follow. This perspective tempers recklessness and short-term thinking. Living with pietas does not erase individuality. It disciplines it. Desire is filtered through responsibility, and ambition is measured against consequence. When pietas is abandoned, societies fragment into isolated selves. When it is upheld, people endure hardship with dignity, knowing their actions contribute to something that will outlast their own comfort. Ananke. Ananke is the ancient realization that everything changes and that nothing you cling to will remain as it is. It is not a poetic observation, but a direct confrontation with impermanence as the fundamental condition of life. Pleasure fades, relationships shift, identities dissolve, and even suffering does not stay fixed. Ananke insists that stability is an illusion created by repetition, not a property of reality. Emotionally, Ananke unsettles the human instinct to hold on. People suffer not only because things end, but because they expect them not to. The mind treats moments as possessions, believing joy should last and pain should stop on command. Ananke exposes how attachment turns natural change into psychological injury. Loss hurts more when permanence was assumed. This concept also brings a strange relief. If everything changes, then despair is not final, and failure is not a permanent identity. The same impermanence that dissolves comfort also dissolves suffering. Emotional states feel endless while inside them, yet Ananke reminds you they are temporary formations, not truths about existence. Ananke challenges the way people define themselves. Roles, achievements, and labels feel solid until time erodes them. When identity is built on what must change, anxiety becomes constant. Ananke encourages a softer grip on the self, a recognition that identity is a process rather than a possession. There is discomfort in this teaching because it removes guarantees. Love has no promise of permanence. Youth has an expiration. Certainty decays. Yet within this discomfort lies clarity. When you stop demanding permanence from temporary things, presence deepens. Moments are experienced fully rather than hoarded. Ananke does not demand detachment from life, but honesty about its nature. Everything arises, everything passes, and peace is not found by stopping change, but by understanding it deeply enough to stop fighting what cannot be held. The Great Chain of Being. The Great Chain of Being is the ancient vision of reality as a structured hierarchy in which every element has its place, from the lowest form of matter to the highest expression of existence. Nothing is random within this framework. Every being occupies a position that reflects its nature, capacity, and function. Order is not imposed. It is assumed to be inherent in the fabric of the world. This concept satisfies a deep human desire for coherence. Chaos becomes tolerable when it appears organized, when suffering feels situated within a larger structure rather than meaningless. The Great Chain of Being reassures by suggesting that nothing exists without purpose, even if that purpose is not immediately visible. Displacement within the chain creates anxiety because it threatens the sense that life is intelligible. Emotionally, this idea explains the pull of status, rank, and identity. Humans instinctively look for where they belong, measuring themselves against others to find orientation. When hierarchy is clear, people feel grounded. When it collapses or becomes arbitrary, resentment and confusion emerge. The fear is not inequality itself, but disorder, the sense that roles are unclear and meaning unstable. The Great Chain of Being also exposes how power justifies itself. Authority claims legitimacy by presenting itself as natural rather than constructed. When hierarchy is framed as cosmic, questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. This makes the concept both stabilizing and dangerous. Living within this framework encourages acceptance of limits. It teaches that not all things are equal in form or function, yet all are connected. When individuals attempt to escape their place without understanding their role, imbalance follows. At the same time, when those higher in the chain forget their responsibility, the entire structure strains. Order holds only when every level recognizes both its position and its duty. Sophrosyne. Sophrosyne is the ancient discipline of self-mastery through balance. It is the ability to govern desire, emotion, and impulse without suppressing them or letting them rule. Rather than chasing extremes, Sophrosyne trains the mind to remain steady, even when temptation, anger, or fear demand immediate reaction. At its core, Sophrosyne is about proportion. It recognizes that excess distorts judgment just as much as deprivation. Pleasure becomes destructive when unmeasured. Ambition becomes dangerous when unchecked. And confidence turns into recklessness when it forgets restraint. Sophrosyne does not deny enjoyment or drive. It calibrates them so they serve life rather than consume it. Emotionally, Sophrosyne creates inner quiet. When impulses are no longer in control, reactions slow and clarity emerges. Instead of being dragged from one emotional spike to another, the individual develops a stable center. This stability is not numbness but strength. Feelings are experienced fully, yet decisions are made deliberately. Sophrosyne also protects dignity. In moments of provocation or desire, it preserves choice. The person guided by Sophrosyne is not easily humiliated, seduced, or manipulated, because their worth is not dependent on immediate gratification or external approval. This makes them difficult to control and difficult to destabilize. The practice of Sophrosyne is demanding because it requires constant awareness. There is no final mastery, only ongoing adjustment. Every situation asks for recalibration. When balance is lost, correction follows. Over time, this discipline shapes character quietly. Life becomes less chaotic, relationships more grounded, and power more sustainable because it is governed rather than unleashed. Shame culture. Shame culture is the ancient social system in which behavior is regulated not by inner conscience, but by the fear of public exposure and loss of status. Right and wrong are not primarily internal judgments. They are determined by how one is seen. Identity, safety, and belonging depend on reputation, making the gaze of others a powerful force shaping action. Emotionally, shame culture creates constant vigilance. The individual learns to monitor behavior through imagined eyes, adjusting speech, posture, and desire to avoid humiliation. This produces compliance, but not inner alignment. People do not ask, "Is this right?" They ask, "How will this look?" The self becomes a performance, carefully maintained to prevent exclusion. This system is effective because humans fear rejection more than punishment. Shame threatens social death, the loss of place within the group. Under shame culture, mistakes feel catastrophic, not because they are immoral, but because they expose vulnerability. Hiding becomes a survival strategy, and authenticity becomes risky. Shame culture also explains why appearances are defended so fiercely. When worth is externally measured, criticism feels existential. Correction is experienced as attack. Growth slows because admitting fault means losing face. This creates cycles of denial, secrecy, and projection, where blame is shifted to preserve image. There is also a quiet cruelty within shame culture. Compassion weakens when maintaining status matters more than understanding context. Punishment becomes public, symbolic, and humiliating, reinforcing norms through fear rather than insight. Order is preserved, but intimacy erodes. Yet shame culture persists because it offers belonging in exchange for conformity. The price is internal fragmentation. When identity depends on approval, self-respect becomes fragile. Shame culture teaches control through visibility, shaping behavior effectively while leaving inner life unresolved and often deeply conflicted beneath the surface. Honor culture. Honor culture is the ancient system where a person's worth is measured by reputation, public respect, and the ability to defend one's name. In this framework, identity is not private. It is social, fragile, and constantly evaluated. Honor must be earned, displayed, and protected because once it is lost, status, safety, and belonging erode with it. This concept arises in environments where formal institutions are weak and survival depends on perception. When law cannot reliably protect you, reputation becomes armor. Respect deters attack. Humiliation invites it. Honor culture therefore trains people to respond quickly to insult, challenge, or disrespect, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. Silence can be interpreted as weakness, and weakness invites threat. Emotionally, honor culture runs on vigilance. Individuals become hyper-aware of how they are seen, spoken to, and remembered. Pride and shame operate as powerful regulators of behavior. Praise elevates, but dishonor burns deeply because it is public and lasting. The fear is not internal guilt, but external exposure, being seen as someone who can be violated without consequence. Honor culture explains why conflicts escalate rapidly and why apologies can feel insufficient. An insult is not just emotional, it is symbolic. Restoring honor often requires visible action, sometimes confrontation, sometimes sacrifice. Peace without restored status feels unstable. At the same time, honor culture creates loyalty and courage. People defend family, community, and principles fiercely because identity is shared. Betrayal cuts deeper than failure. Living within honor culture means carrying your name like a weapon and a responsibility, knowing that how you act reflects not only on you, but on those tied to you. Reputation becomes survival, and respect becomes currency. Divine right. Divine right is the ancient belief that authority is not granted by people, but sanctioned by a higher power. It frames leadership as sacred rather than contractual, placing rulers above ordinary accountability. When power is believed to come from the divine, obedience becomes a moral duty rather than a political choice. At its core, divine right explains how hierarchy stabilizes itself. If authority is seen as chosen by fate or God, resistance feels dangerous, not only socially, but spiritually. This belief quiets doubt and suppresses challenge, because questioning leadership becomes equivalent to questioning order itself. Power protects itself by becoming untouchable. Emotionally, divine right feeds the human desire for certainty. In chaotic times, people seek figures who appear ordained, inevitable, and larger than life. Believing someone is divinely chosen relieves the anxiety of responsibility. If outcomes are pre-approved by a higher force, then suffering can be rationalized and injustice reframed as necessary or deserved. Divine right also reshapes identity. Leaders begin to see themselves as symbols rather than servants, while followers internalize obedience as virtue. Over time, this separation erodes empathy and accountability. Mistakes are excused, cruelty is justified, and dissent is labeled immoral rather than corrective. The danger of divine right lies in its insulation of power. When authority no longer depends on trust or competence, correction becomes nearly impossible. Decay hides behind reverence. The belief does not require proof to persist, only repetition and fear. Once power is sacred, it no longer needs to listen, and when listening disappears, collapse begins quietly, long before it becomes visible. Animism. Animism is the ancient perception that the world is alive, that spirit, intention, or awareness exists not only in humans, but in animals, objects, places, and natural forces. Rather than seeing reality as inert matter, animism experiences it as relational. Everything encountered is something to be engaged with, respected, or negotiated with, not merely used. Emotionally, animism dissolves isolation. When the world is perceived as alive, existence feels participatory rather than alienating. Forests listen, rivers remember, tools respond. This creates a sense of belonging that modern abstraction often erases. Fear softens because one is surrounded not by dead matter, but by presences with which relationship is possible. Animism also reshapes responsibility. If things are alive, exploitation feels different. Harm is not neutral. Taking without regard becomes a violation rather than a transaction. This is why animistic cultures develop rituals of permission and gratitude. These acts regulate behavior by embedding ethics into perception itself. There is also emotional danger in animism. When intention is projected everywhere, randomness can feel personal. Misfortune becomes a message. This can create anxiety or superstition, where neutral events are overinterpreted as signs. Animism blurs the line between meaning and causation, making the world feel intimate but unpredictable. Yet animism explains a deep human instinct that persists beneath rational frameworks. People name cars, talk to technology, feel guilt toward environments, and attribute moods to spaces. These behaviors are echoes of animistic perception. They reveal a refusal to experience reality as empty or indifferent. Animism teaches that meaning arises through relationship. Even when stripped of literal belief, the emotional truth remains. When the world is treated as alive, attention deepens, care increases, and existence feels less disposable. The cost is ambiguity, but the reward is connection in a universe that otherwise feels silent. Mystery cults. Mystery cults were ancient systems built around secrecy, initiation, and hidden knowledge, offering participants the promise of transformation rather than explanation. What defined them was not public doctrine, but private experience. Truth was not taught openly, it was revealed gradually to those who proved devotion, endurance, and readiness. Knowledge gained too easily was considered dangerous or hollow. These cults emerged from a deep psychological hunger, the need to feel chosen in a world that feels indifferent. Mystery cults created meaning through exclusion. To know something others did not was to feel protected from chaos, death, and uncertainty. The initiate crossed a symbolic boundary, leaving behind the ordinary world and entering a reality charged with significance. Emotionally, mystery cults thrived on anticipation and fear. The unknown was not avoided. It was ritualized. Darkness, silence, symbolic death, and rebirth were used to destabilize identity so it could be rebuilt. This process forged intense loyalty because shared secrets create bonds stronger than shared beliefs. What you suffer for, you value more deeply. Mystery cults also reveal the power of narrative over logic. The experiences were often ineffable, not meant to be explained clearly. This ambiguity made them immune to criticism. If you did not understand, it was because you were not initiated. Meaning became personal and unquestionable. Psychologically, mystery cults offered relief from existential dread. They promised continuity beyond death, cosmic order behind suffering, and purpose hidden beneath confusion. Even when the rituals were symbolic, the emotional impact was real. Participants felt seen by something larger than themselves. Living within a mystery cult meant surrendering certainty in exchange for belonging. The promise was not control, but transformation. By stepping into the unknown voluntarily, initiates learned to endure uncertainty, trusting that meaning would emerge not through clarity, but through experience that could never be fully translated into words. Mnemosyne. Mnemosyne is the ancient recognition that memory is the foundation of identity. It represents the force that binds past experience into a coherent sense of self, allowing people to know who they are by remembering who they have been. Without memory, continuity collapses, and life becomes a series of disconnected moments with no narrative holding them together. At its core, Mnemosyne explains why forgetting is so destabilizing. Memory does more than store events. It shapes meaning. What is remembered is reinforced. What is forgotten fades, and what is distorted reshapes reality. This is why control over memory, through stories, history, or selective recall, becomes a form of power. Those who shape memory shape identity. Emotionally, Mnemosyne governs attachment and loss. People cling to memories because they preserve relationships, values, and a sense of belonging that time threatens to erase. Grief hurts because memory refuses to disappear. Nostalgia pulls because memory softens pain while amplifying meaning. Even trauma persists because memory keeps the nervous system alert to past danger. Mnemosyne also explains repetition. Unprocessed memories resurface as behavior. Old fears guide new decisions. Unresolved wounds influence present relationships, and forgotten lessons are relearned through pain. Memory is not passive, it acts. This concept reveals why reflection is powerful and dangerous. Remembering truthfully can heal, but selective memory can imprison. When people rewrite their past to protect ego, they lose clarity. When societies erase memory to preserve comfort, they repeat collapse. Mnemosyne insists that awareness of the past is not optional. Identity, individually and collectively, depends on what is carried forward and what is allowed to be forgotten. Sacrifice. Sacrifice is the ancient understanding that meaning is purchased, not granted. It is the act of willingly giving up something valued in order to preserve, protect, or elevate something greater. At its core, sacrifice acknowledges that not everything can be kept and that choice always involves loss. What is surrendered defines what is honored. Emotionally, sacrifice carries weight because it forces clarity. You cannot sacrifice accidentally. The moment of offering exposes priorities with painful honesty. Comfort, time, status, desire, or safety are placed on one side and purpose on the other. This tension creates significance. Without cost, actions feel hollow. With cost, they become binding. Sacrifice also explains why suffering can feel meaningful or unbearable depending on context. Pain endured for nothing breeds resentment. Pain endured for something creates endurance. Sacrifice transforms loss into structure, turning chaos into narrative. This is why humans ritualize sacrifice, marking loss so it does not dissolve into randomness. There is danger within this concept. Sacrifice can be demanded rather than chosen. When authority glorifies suffering without consent, sacrifice becomes exploitation. Individuals are taught to bleed for symbols that do not return value. This distortion turns devotion into destruction. Yet voluntary sacrifice remains psychologically powerful. It creates identity. What you give up becomes proof of belief, anchoring values in action rather than intention. Sacrifice also limits desire, preventing excess from eroding meaning. When nothing is refused, nothing matters. Sacrifice reveals that fulfillment is not found in accumulation, but in selection. To choose one path is to abandon others. To love one thing is to relinquish alternatives. Meaning sharpens where loss is accepted rather than denied, and where what is surrendered is not wasted, but offered deliberately towards something that justifies the cost. Reciprocity. Reciprocity is the ancient social law that relationships survive only when giving and receiving remain in balance. It is the unspoken expectation that kindness invites kindness, effort deserves effort, and generosity creates obligation. Long before contracts or institutions existed, reciprocity held communities together through memory, trust, and mutual dependence. This concept operates beneath conscious thought. When someone gives without acknowledgement, tension forms. When one side takes repeatedly, resentment grows. Reciprocity explains why unequal relationships feel unstable even when no rules are broken. The imbalance registers emotionally before it becomes rational. Humans are wired to track fairness because survival once depended on cooperation that could not afford exploitation. Emotionally, reciprocity shapes trust. When exchanges feel fair, people relax. When they feel one-sided, vigilance appears. This is why small gestures matter. A returned favor, a remembered kindness, or a shared burden communicates reliability more than words. Reciprocity creates emotional safety by signaling that effort will not be wasted. Reciprocity also reveals the danger of manipulation. Gifts can be used to create debt, generosity to demand loyalty, kindness to control. When reciprocity becomes transactional rather than relational, it distorts connection. People feel trapped rather than bonded, obligated rather than willing. At its healthiest, reciprocity is fluid, not calculated. It allows for imbalance in moments of need, trusting that equilibrium will return over time. It recognizes that equality is measured across relationships, not single exchanges. Living by reciprocity means staying attentive to balance without turning relationships into ledgers. It requires sensitivity, memory, and restraint, knowing when to give freely and when to restore fairness. When reciprocity breaks down, communities fragment. When it holds, cooperation feels natural, trust deepens, and social life becomes resilient rather than fragile. Cosmic justice. Cosmic justice is the ancient belief that the universe itself tends toward balance, even when human systems fail to deliver it. It suggests that actions resonate beyond courts, laws, and social judgment, eventually returning consequences that restore equilibrium. When wrongdoing goes unpunished or virtue unrewarded, cosmic justice offers the unsettling idea that resolution is delayed, not denied. At its core, cosmic justice answers the emotional discomfort of unfairness. People instinctively sense that cruelty, betrayal, and exploitation should not vanish into nothing. This belief arises not from naivete, but from the need for moral coherence. Without some form of universal accounting, suffering feels meaningless and power feels arbitrary. Cosmic justice restores the idea that reality itself remembers. Emotionally, cosmic justice is both comforting and threatening. It reassures those who endure injustice in silence, suggesting that harm leaves a mark even when no one intervenes. At the same time, it unsettles those who benefit from wrongdoing because it removes the illusion of escape. Even if consequences are invisible or delayed, they are accumulating somewhere beyond immediate perception. Cosmic justice also reframes success. Prosperity gained through deception feels unstable under this lens, as if it carries a hidden cost yet to be paid. Likewise, quiet integrity gains weight, even when it seems ignored. The belief insists that outcomes are not isolated events, but parts of a longer moral sequence. This concept does not promise timing or spectacle. Justice may arrive subtly through loss of trust, inner decay, or the erosion of stability rather than dramatic punishment. Cosmic justice operates without witnesses, without announcements, and without mercy for denial. It exists as a pressure within reality itself, reminding humans that imbalance cannot be sustained forever and that every action bends the scales whether anyone is watching or not. Augury. Augury is the ancient practice of seeking guidance by interpreting signs within uncertainty. It reflects the human need to find direction when logic reaches its limits and outcomes remain unknowable. When the future feels threatening or opaque, augury steps in to transform randomness into message, offering orientation where clarity is absent. Emotionally, augury reveals how deeply humans fear unstructured uncertainty. Not knowing what comes next creates anxiety that demands resolution. Augury soothes this tension by suggesting that the world communicates, that events are not silent. A bird's flight, a pattern in nature, or an unexpected coincidence becomes a symbol that reduces paralysis and restores the feeling of movement. This practice also exposes the psychology of decision-making under pressure. When choices feel heavy and consequences irreversible, responsibility becomes frightening. Augury externalizes that burden. The sign chooses, not the individual. This can bring relief, but it also weakens agency. What feels like guidance can quietly become avoidance. Augury blurs the boundary between perception and projection. The signs do not speak, the interpreter does. Desire, fear, and expectation shape what is seen. This is why augury often confirms what the seeker already suspects. Emotionally, this reinforces belief while masking its origin. The answer feels revealed rather than chosen, yet augury persists because it reflects a truth about the human mind. People do not act on information alone. They act on meaning. Patterns provide courage when data cannot. Even today, individuals read signs in timing, coincidences, and intuition before making decisions they cannot fully rationalize. Augury teaches that uncertainty is intolerable without narrative. When the future refuses to speak plainly, the mind invents dialogue. Whether mystical or psychological, augury shows how humans translate ambiguity into direction, not because it guarantees truth, but because movement feels safer than standing still in silence. Labyrinth. The labyrinth is the ancient symbol of complexity as a test rather than an obstacle. It represents the experience of being lost, disoriented, and forced inward when familiar paths disappear. Unlike a maze designed to trick, the labyrinth confronts you with confusion that cannot be avoided, only endured. The lesson is not speed or cleverness, but persistence and attention. This concept reflects a psychological truth. Growth rarely follows straight lines. When life becomes complicated, people instinctively search for shortcuts, explanations, or external guides. The labyrinth removes those comforts. Progress happens through movement itself, step by step, without knowing how long the journey will take or what waits at the center. Emotionally, the labyrinth mirrors inner struggle. Fear rises when direction is unclear. Doubt grows when effort does not produce immediate clarity. The urge to quit becomes strongest just before insight appears. The labyrinth teaches that confusion is not a sign of failure, but a necessary condition for transformation. Identity breaks down in complexity so it can be reassembled with intention. The center of the labyrinth symbolizes confrontation. Whatever is avoided, denied, or feared waits there. Reaching it requires patience and the willingness to remain present despite uncertainty. Escape is not the goal, understanding is. The return journey matters as much as the arrival, because insight must be carried back into ordinary life. Living through a labyrinth experience changes how uncertainty is faced. Instead of panicking at complexity, you learn to move within it. Each step becomes sufficient. Control is replaced with endurance, certainty with curiosity. The labyrinth does not promise ease, but it offers depth. Those who rush through miss its meaning. Those who stay engaged emerge altered, not because the path became simple, but because they learned how to walk it without needing to see the end. Shadow self. The shadow self is the ancient recognition that parts of the human psyche are hidden, denied, or rejected, yet remain active beneath the surface. It contains impulses, desires, fears, and traits that conflict with the identity a person wants to present to the world. The shadow does not disappear when ignored. It gains influence precisely because it is unseen. At its core, the shadow self explains why people act against their stated values. Traits that are suppressed do not dissolve. They reroute. Anger denied becomes passive aggression. Desire rejected turns into obsession. Insecurity hidden behind confidence leaks out as control. The shadow expresses itself indirectly, often in ways that feel out of character yet strangely familiar. Emotionally, the shadow self governs projection. People tend to condemn most fiercely what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. What triggers intense reaction in others often mirrors something unintegrated within. This is why certain behaviors feel personally offensive rather than merely wrong. The shadow recognizes itself even when the conscious mind does not. The shadow also feeds self-sabotage. When parts of the self are disowned, wholeness becomes impossible. Success can feel undeserved, intimacy threatening, and peace unfamiliar. The psyche creates disruption to remain consistent with its hidden narrative. Confronting the shadow is uncomfortable because it collapses moral simplicity. You are forced to see your capacity for the very things you judge. Yet this confrontation is where power returns. When the shadow is named, it loses its autonomy. Awareness transforms it from a hidden driver into a visible force that can be directed. Integration does not mean indulgence, but ownership. When the shadow is acknowledged, behavior becomes conscious rather than compulsive, and identity becomes whole rather than performative. Fasting. Fasting is the ancient discipline of deliberately denying the body in order to clarify the mind. It is not rooted in punishment, but in control. By stepping away from constant consumption, fasting exposes how deeply desire governs behavior. Hunger becomes a teacher, revealing impulses that usually remain hidden beneath comfort and routine. Emotionally, fasting confronts dependency. Modern life trains the nervous system to expect immediate satisfaction. When that expectation is interrupted, discomfort rises quickly. Irritability, restlessness, and craving surface, not because the body is in danger, but because identity is entangled with indulgence. Fasting strips away this illusion, showing how much of behavior is reactive rather than chosen. This practice also sharpens awareness. When the noise of constant intake fades, perception intensifies, sensations become clearer, thoughts slow. What once felt urgent begins to feel optional. Fasting creates psychological space, allowing observation instead of impulse. In this space, discipline replaces compulsion. There is also vulnerability in fasting. Without the buffer of consumption, emotional patterns emerge. People often discover that they eat not only for nourishment, but to numb boredom, anxiety, or loneliness. Fasting reveals these substitutes for meaning. The body is quiet, but the mind speaks loudly. Fasting has always been tied to spiritual clarity because it weakens the illusion of control through excess. When the body learns it can endure discomfort without collapse, fear loses its authority. Restraint becomes empowering rather than restrictive. This practice also carries risk when driven by shame or obsession. When denial replaces insight, fasting turns destructive. Its power lies in intention. When chosen consciously, fasting becomes a reminder that freedom is not found in endless fulfillment, but in the ability to refuse without fear and to listen to what remains when desire is temporarily silenced. Ritual purification. Ritual purification is the ancient practice of cleansing guilt, shame, and moral contamination through symbolic action. It arises from the recognition that wrongdoing leaves a psychological residue that logic alone cannot remove. Even when mistakes are acknowledged or forgiven intellectually, the emotional weight often remains. Ritual purification exists to release that weight. This concept treats impurity not as dirt, but as imbalance. Certain actions, experiences, or violations disrupt inner order and create a sense of heaviness that lingers. Rituals give form to this invisible burden, transforming abstract guilt into something that can be washed, burned, buried, or released. The body becomes involved so the mind can finally let go. Emotionally, ritual purification offers relief where explanation fails. Shame thrives in silence and abstraction. When purification is enacted publicly or privately, the burden becomes contained. The individual is no longer endlessly defined by the transgression. The ritual marks a boundary between before and after, allowing identity to reset. Ritual purification also restores belonging. Communities rely on shared moral space. When that space is violated, trust fractures. Rituals signal accountability without permanent exclusion. They communicate that restoration is possible, that error does not equal exile. This prevents both denial and endless punishment. Psychologically, purification rituals regulate emotion by externalizing internal conflict. They provide closure without repression. Whether through water, fire, fasting, confession, or silence, the act creates permission to move forward. Without such markers, people remain trapped in cycles of self-reproach, even after making amends. Living with ritual purification means recognizing that humans need symbolic endings as much as rational explanations. Healing requires more than understanding. It requires release. When purification is absent, guilt accumulates and identity stagnates. When it is present, responsibility is honored without allowing the past to consume the future. Oracle authority. Oracle authority is the ancient tendency to outsource uncertainty to a perceived higher voice. It emerges when decisions feel too complex, too risky, or too heavy to carry alone. Rather than trusting personal judgment, people look for signs, experts, omens, algorithms, or figures who claim privileged access to truth. The oracle becomes a psychological shelter from responsibility. At its core, oracle authority explains why humans seek certainty even at the cost of autonomy. When consequences are frightening, ambiguity feels unbearable. Submitting to an oracle allows people to say, "I didn't choose this. It was revealed." This belief softens guilt and fear, replacing agency with obedience. The relief is immediate, but the cost is subtle. Emotionally, oracle authority thrives on anxiety. The more unstable the world feels, the more appealing absolute answers become. People gravitate toward voices that speak confidently, decisively, and without doubt. Accuracy becomes less important than reassurance. Over time, trust shifts away from lived experience and inward intuition toward external validation. Oracle authority also reshapes power. Those seen as interpreters of truth gain influence without accountability. When predictions fail, blame is redirected to misinterpretation or insufficient faith. This keeps the system intact while discouraging critical thought. Dependence deepens because questioning the oracle feels like inviting chaos. The danger lies in the gradual erosion of discernment. When guidance replaces judgment, people stop learning from consequences. Growth stalls because mistakes are no longer owned. Oracle authority does not eliminate uncertainty, it anesthetizes it. The comfort it offers is real, but temporary. Beneath it remains the unresolved fear of choosing wrongly, waiting for the next voice to decide what you will do. The hero's journey. The hero's journey is the ancient narrative pattern that frames growth as a movement through disruption, loss, and transformation. It suggests that identity is not formed through comfort, but through departure from what is familiar. The journey begins when the ordinary world becomes intolerable, forcing confrontation with uncertainty rather than allowing stagnation to continue quietly. Emotionally, this pattern resonates because it mirrors inner development. A challenge appears, often unwanted, and refusal is tempting. Fear of loss, failure, or exposure delays action. Yet remaining unchanged begins to cost more than leaving. The call is not heroic in tone. It is unsettling, demanding the abandonment of certainty. What is left behind cannot be carried forward unchanged. The journey's trials represent psychological confrontation. Obstacles are not merely external enemies, but internal resistances, doubts, and inherited limitations. Each test strips away illusions of control and forces adaptation. Mentors appear not to save, but to redirect attention toward inner resources. The hero learns not by avoiding pain, but by surviving it with awareness. Emotionally, the underworld phase reflects collapse. Identity dissolves. The self that began the journey cannot continue unchanged. This loss feels like failure, yet it creates the conditions for insight. Transformation emerges not as reward, but as necessity. Without shedding the old self, return is impossible. The return completes the cycle. The hero comes back altered, carrying knowledge earned through suffering. This knowledge is not abstract. It is lived, embodied, and costly. The journey matters because it is never fully chosen. Life initiates it through crisis. The real question is not whether the journey will happen, but whether it will be resisted or entered consciously, allowing transformation instead of bitterness to take root.
Bloodline Destiny.
Bloodline destiny is the ancient belief that identity, fate, and obligation are inherited, not chosen. It assumes that a person enters life carrying the weight of their lineage, its achievements, failures, promises, and unfinished debts. Who you are is inseparable from where you come from, and the past is never truly past because it continues through blood. This concept emerges from societies where survival depended on continuity. Family was not just emotional, it was economic, political, and spiritual. To belong to a bloodline meant protection, but it also meant expectation. Your actions reflected on ancestors and descendants alike. Honor elevated the line, disgrace stained it. Individual desire mattered less than collective continuity. Emotionally, Bloodline Destiny explains the pressure many people feel without fully understanding why. The urge to live up to a name, to redeem a family history, or to avoid repeating inherited mistakes creates an invisible burden. Even rebellion is often shaped by lineage, a reaction against what came before rather than true independence. Bloodline Destiny also provides meaning in suffering. Hardship can be framed as part of a larger narrative rather than personal failure. Pain becomes something endured for the sake of the line, transforming endurance into purpose. This can create strength, but it can also trap individuals in roles they did not choose. Living under Bloodline Destiny means navigating loyalty and selfhood. To deny lineage entirely is to sever roots. To submit to it blindly is to erase agency. The tension itself becomes formative. Identity is shaped through negotiation, deciding what to carry forward and what to release. Bloodline Destiny does not disappear in modern life. It shifts inward, shaping ambition, guilt, pride, and fear. Whether embraced or resisted, the past continues to speak through those who inherit it. Divine madness. Divine madness is the ancient idea that certain forms of instability are not defects, but gateways. It describes states where reason loosens its grip, allowing insight, creativity, and vision to emerge from beyond ordinary consciousness. Rather than treating madness solely as disorder, this concept recognizes that some truths cannot be accessed through control and logic alone. At its core, divine madness explains why visionaries often appear unbalanced. When perception widens beyond social norms, it disrupts comfort and predictability. Those touched by divine madness see patterns others ignore, feel emotions more intensely, and speak ideas that sound dangerous or irrational at first. This sensitivity can produce art, prophecy, and transformation, but it comes with vulnerability. Emotionally, divine madness is both intoxicating and isolating. The experience feels like being flooded with meaning while lacking the language or safety to contain it. Society often fears what it cannot regulate, so those who embody divine madness are pushed to the margins, revered and rejected at the same time. Admiration only arrives after their insights are made safe. Divine madness also reveals the limits of rational identity. It exposes how much of what is called sanity is simply agreement. When someone steps outside those boundaries, they threaten the illusion of stability. This is why unconventional insight is often dismissed as delusion before it is understood. The danger of divine madness lies in imbalance. Without grounding, revelation can overwhelm the self. Without structure, inspiration can consume rather than illuminate. Yet when integrated, divine madness becomes a source of renewal. It shakes stagnant systems, challenges dead assumptions, and reminds humanity that not all wisdom arrives calmly. Some truths break in violently, demanding to be felt before they can be understood. Ancestor Veneration. Ancestor veneration is the ancient recognition that identity does not begin with the individual, but arrives through lineage. It is the practice of honoring those who came before, not as distant history, but as active influences shaping character, opportunity, and obligation. The living are seen as extensions of the dead, carrying unfinished stories forward. Emotionally, ancestor veneration addresses the fear of rootlessness. When life feels fragmented or directionless, lineage offers continuity. Suffering gains context. Strength feels inherited rather than accidental. Remembering ancestors creates a sense of belonging that stretches across time, reducing the loneliness of individual existence. This concept also introduces responsibility. If identity is inherited, actions echo backward as well as forward. One's behavior reflects not only the self, but the lineage behind it. This can feel heavy, especially when honoring ancestors means carrying their sacrifices or correcting their failures. Guilt and pride become intertwined, shaping motivation. Ancestor veneration also explains why family stories carry emotional power. Names, rituals, and memories stabilize identity by embedding it in narrative. When these connections are severed, people often experience disorientation. Without a past to anchor meaning, the present becomes fragile. There is danger in this practice when reverence hardens into obligation. Blind loyalty to lineage can trap individuals in roles they did not choose. Tradition becomes authority rather than guidance. Growth stalls when the past is preserved without question. Yet, when practiced consciously, ancestor veneration offers grounding rather than confinement. It honors influence without surrendering autonomy. It acknowledges that no one stands alone, that strength is accumulated across generations. By remembering those who endured before, the individual gains perspective on their own struggle, realizing they are part of a longer human effort rather than an isolated moment destined to disappear without trace.
Sacred kingship.
Sacred kingship is the ancient belief that a ruler is not merely a political figure, but a living symbol of order, stability, and cosmic balance. The king's body, actions, and moral state are believed to mirror the condition of the world itself. When the ruler is just, the land prospers. When the ruler is corrupt, decay spreads. Leadership is not administrative, it is existential. This concept emerges from the human need to anchor chaos to a visible center. Abstract systems feel distant, but a person can be watched, judged, blamed, or revered. Sacred kingship concentrates collective hopes and fears into a single figure, turning leadership into a sacred burden rather than a privilege. Power is legitimized not by force alone, but by symbolic responsibility. Emotionally, sacred kingship explains why people project intensely onto leaders. Faith, rage, loyalty, and betrayal become personal. A good ruler feels like protection. A failed ruler feels like abandonment. When leaders fall, it is experienced as moral collapse, not just political failure, because the symbol has shattered. Sacred kingship also contains a dark contract. The ruler is elevated, but never free. Their identity dissolves into the role. Personal desire must be sacrificed to maintain order. In many traditions, if famine, plague, or disorder appeared, the king himself was blamed, punished, or even sacrificed. Power demanded payment. Psychologically, sacred kingship reveals the cost of authority. Those placed at the top are expected to embody ideals that no human can sustain indefinitely. The myth persists because it offers meaning, but it also creates impossible expectations. Living under sacred kingship means believing that order flows downward from leadership. When that belief breaks, trust fractures. The figure remains, but the sacred meaning drains away, leaving power exposed as fragile, conditional, and deeply human. Collective guilt. Collective guilt is the ancient recognition that responsibility can extend beyond the individual. It describes the emotional and moral weight carried by a group for actions committed in its name, by its members, or under its protection. Even those who did not directly participate can feel implicated because belonging ties identity to shared outcomes. At its core, collective guilt explains why history does not stay in the past. Unaddressed harm lingers in cultures, institutions, and families, shaping behavior long after the original actors are gone. Silence, benefit, or passive acceptance can bind people to wrongdoing as effectively as direct action. Collective guilt emerges when people sense that advantage was inherited without accountability. Emotionally, collective guilt is deeply uncomfortable because it challenges the belief in purely personal innocence. It forces confrontation with the idea that moral responsibility is not limited to intent. This creates defensiveness, denial, or shame, especially when identity feels threatened. People resist collective guilt not because it is false, but because it destabilizes the self-image of fairness and neutrality. Collective guilt also explains why societies struggle with reconciliation. Acknowledging shared responsibility risks loss of status, power, or moral authority. Yet avoidance only deepens resentment and fracture. When guilt is suppressed, it mutates into polarization, blame shifting, and historical amnesia. This concept is not about eternal punishment or inherited sin. It is about repair. Collective guilt becomes constructive when it leads to recognition, accountability, and correction. Without that movement, guilt remains unresolved, quietly shaping fear, tension, and mistrust. Groups that refuse to carry their past are forced to repeat it in different forms, while those that face it directly gain the possibility of continuity without denial. Dream interpretation. Dream interpretation is the ancient attempt to listen to the mind when conscious control is absent. Dreams emerge when the waking self loosens its grip, allowing suppressed fears, desires, memories, and conflicts to surface in symbolic form. Rather than speaking directly, the mind translates emotion into imagery, bypassing logic to communicate what cannot be easily admitted. Emotionally, dream interpretation confronts the parts of the self that remain unspoken during the day. In waking life, attention is filtered and disciplined. At night, that discipline collapses. What appears in dreams often feels strange or exaggerated, yet the emotional charge is real. Anxiety becomes monsters, guilt becomes pursuit, longing becomes reunion. The symbols may confuse, but the feelings are precise. This practice recognizes that understanding does not always arrive through reasoning. Some truths are too threatening or complex to approach directly. Dreams offer distance through metaphor, allowing confrontation without immediate defense. Interpreting them becomes an act of courage because it requires acknowledging what the mind is already processing beneath awareness. Dream interpretation also reveals patterns. Repeated symbols point to unresolved tensions. Recurring dreams signal resistance to change. Nightmares often intensify when something in waking life is being avoided. The dream does not punish, it insists. There is danger in overinterpretation. Not every image is prophetic. When symbolism is forced, meaning becomes projection. Yet dismissing dreams entirely ignores a valuable source of insight. Dreams do not predict the future, they expose the present. This ancient practice persists because humans sense that consciousness is layered. What is ignored does not disappear, it reappears disguised. Dream interpretation is the effort to translate that language, to bring hidden emotional knowledge into awareness before it demands attention through crisis, behavior, or silent erosion of inner stability. Trial by ordeal. Trial by ordeal is the ancient belief that truth reveals itself under extreme pressure. When human judgment feels unreliable or corruptible, suffering becomes the test. Pain, danger, and risk are treated as instruments of revelation, exposing guilt or innocence through endurance rather than evidence. Survival is interpreted as moral validation. This concept arises from desperation for certainty. When trust in institutions erodes, people turn to forces believed to be impartial: fire, water, hardship, or fate itself. The ordeal removes ambiguity by placing the individual in a situation where outcomes feel beyond manipulation. If the person withstands the trial, they are seen as aligned with truth. If they fail, the failure is framed as deserved. Emotionally, trial by ordeal speaks to the belief that suffering purifies. Pain becomes proof of worth. Endurance is equated with righteousness. This creates a powerful psychological link between hardship and legitimacy, shaping cultures where struggle is glorified and ease is viewed with suspicion. Trial by ordeal also reveals a darker impulse, the need to externalize responsibility. By surrendering judgment to an ordeal, communities avoid confronting their own biases and fears. The outcome feels absolute, even when it is arbitrary. Violence becomes acceptable when framed as sacred testing. This logic persists in modern life. People are expected to prove themselves through exhaustion, humiliation, or crisis. Survival becomes evidence of strength, while collapse is judged as weakness. The system feels fair because it is harsh to everyone, even when it is unjust. Living under trial by ordeal trains people to equate pain with truth. Vulnerability becomes dangerous, and mercy feels like corruption. The lesson is brutal but seductive. If you can endure enough, you must be right. Yet this belief erases context, compassion, and complexity, replacing understanding with endurance as the final measure of value. Fate weaving. Fate weaving is the ancient sense that individual lives are not isolated threads, but strands interlaced within a larger pattern. It describes how choices, accidents, relationships, and timing intertwine to create outcomes no single person fully controls. Life unfolds not as a straight line, but as a fabric shaped by countless crossings. At its core, fate weaving explains the tension between agency and inevitability. You make decisions, yet those decisions collide with others in ways you could never predict. A single encounter alters direction. A delay prevents disaster. A loss creates an opening that did not exist before. Fate weaving suggests that meaning emerges not from control, but from connection. Emotionally, this concept softens both regret and pride. It reminds people that success is rarely self-made and failure rarely solitary. The weight of total responsibility lightens when life is seen as collaborative, even when that collaboration includes conflict and chance. At the same time, it challenges the fantasy of complete independence. Fate weaving also explains why certain events feel destined only in retrospect. Patterns become visible after the thread has passed through the loom. What once felt random begins to look arranged, not by design necessarily, but by convergence. This retrospective coherence gives life narrative depth, even when the present feels chaotic. The danger of fate weaving lies in passivity. Believing everything is woven can excuse inaction, yet the concept does not remove choice. It contextualizes it. Each decision adds tension, color, or strength to the pattern. You cannot see the whole fabric, but your thread still matters. Fate weaving asks you to act with awareness, knowing your life shapes and is shaped by others simultaneously. Chthonic Forces. Chthonic forces represent the ancient understanding that beneath order, reason, and social structure lie deeper, darker energies that cannot be erased, only contained. These forces are associated with the underground, the unseen, and the primal aspects of existence. They symbolize instinct, death, sexuality, rage, and chaos, elements that civilized life depends on while pretending to transcend. Emotionally, chthonic forces explain the fear of what is buried. Humans are taught to suppress impulses that threaten stability, yet suppression does not destroy them. What is pushed underground gains pressure. When ignored too long, it erupts through violence, obsession, or breakdown. Chthonic forces remind us that darkness denied becomes darkness uncontrolled. This concept also reveals why order feels fragile. Civilization requires constant maintenance because it is built over something wild. Rules, rituals, and institutions act as barriers, not eliminations. When these structures weaken, what was restrained resurfaces. This creates both terror and fascination. People are drawn to destruction, not because they desire collapse, but because chthonic energy feels honest in a world of restraint. There is emotional danger in romanticizing these forces. Chaos without containment does not liberate, it consumes. Chthonic energy overwhelms when it lacks structure. This is why ancient cultures treated the underworld with ritual and fear rather than worship. The goal was balance, not surrender. Chthonic forces also explain internal conflict. The civilized self wants control, meaning, and acceptance. The buried self wants release, intensity, and truth without consequence. Ignoring this tension creates fragmentation. Acknowledging it allows integration. This concept teaches that maturity is not purity, but containment. Strength is not the absence of darkness, but the ability to face it without being ruled by it. What lies beneath must be respected, named, and limited, or it will define reality from below. Initiation rites. Initiation rites are the ancient mechanisms through which identity is broken down and rebuilt. They mark the passage from one state of being to another, child to adult, outsider to insider, ordinary to initiated. These rites are not symbolic in a gentle sense. They are designed to unsettle, disorient, and strip away previous identity so that a new one can take its place. This concept recognizes that transformation does not happen through information alone. To truly change, a person must be pushed beyond familiarity. Initiation rites use separation, hardship, fear, and challenge to force confrontation with vulnerability. The initiate is removed from normal life, cut off from previous roles, and placed in an in-between state where identity is unstable. Emotionally, initiation rites address the fear of becoming. Growth threatens the self you know. By ritualizing danger and discomfort, societies gave structure to transformation, preventing chaos. Pain becomes meaningful because it is witnessed and sanctioned. Endurance becomes proof that the individual is ready to carry new responsibility. Initiation also creates belonging. Shared suffering forges loyalty stronger than shared belief. Those who pass through the same trials recognize each other as equals, bonded by experience that cannot be easily explained. The group becomes family, and the identity gained feels earned rather than assigned. Psychologically, initiation rites prevent prolonged adolescence. Without clear thresholds, people remain suspended between roles, uncertain of who they are allowed to be. Initiation draws a line that cannot be undone. Afterward, the world relates to you differently, and you relate to yourself differently. Living without initiation creates drift. Living through it creates orientation. Even when modern life lacks formal rites, people seek substitutes through challenges, crises, and self-imposed trials. The instinct remains the same: to suffer meaningfully so identity can solidify, and purpose can feel deserved rather than imagined. Divine retribution. Divine retribution is the ancient belief that wrongdoing inevitably summons a corrective force beyond human judgment. It rests on the idea that moral imbalance cannot persist indefinitely, even when it appears rewarded or ignored. When justice fails on earth, something larger is believed to respond, not out of anger, but out of necessity. At its core, divine retribution explains the fear that follows guilt. People may escape consequences socially, legally, or politically, yet still feel pursued by an invisible reckoning. This belief arises from the intuition that actions disturb an order deeper than law. When that order is violated, restoration demands a price. Retribution is not always immediate, but it is imagined as unavoidable. Emotionally, divine retribution governs restraint. It warns that power without accountability is an illusion. Even when no one sees, something remembers. This creates a psychological boundary where external enforcement is absent. The fear is not punishment alone, but exposure. Divine retribution, threatens the idea that one can remain untouched by their own actions. This concept also comforts those who suffer injustice. It offers the belief that harm does not vanish into silence. Even if the oppressor thrives, the imbalance is accumulating elsewhere. This does not erase pain, but it prevents despair from fully collapsing into meaninglessness. Divine retribution is often misunderstood as revenge, but its logic is corrective rather than emotional. The consequence may come as loss of trust, inner decay, isolation, or the unraveling of stability rather than dramatic punishment. What matters is that imbalance resolves. The danger of divine retribution lies in projection. When people believe they represent divine judgment, cruelty follows. Yet stripped of human ego, the idea functions as a reminder. Actions echo beyond the moment. Nothing harmful is ever fully escaped. The reckoning may be quiet, delayed, or internal, but the universe does not forget disturbance. Cyclical time. Cyclical time is the ancient perception that life moves in repeating patterns rather than a straight, irreversible line. Instead of constant progress towards something new, existence unfolds through return, renewal, decay, and repetition. Birth follows death, growth follows collapse, and what ends often reappears in altered form. Nothing is final, everything circles back. Emotionally, cyclical time reshapes how loss and failure are experienced. In linear thinking, mistakes feel permanent, and decline feels humiliating. Cyclical time softens this fear. What falls is not erased, it is transformed. Endings become transitions rather than annihilations. This creates resilience because despair no longer signals final defeat, but a phase within a larger rhythm. This concept also explains the frustration of repeating lessons. People often feel ashamed when old patterns return, believing growth should be one-directional. Cyclical time reframes recurrence as natural. Understanding deepens through repetition, not avoidance. What was not integrated resurfaces until it is faced differently. Cyclical time also challenges obsession with speed. If life moves in loops, rushing becomes unnecessary. Seasons cannot be forced. Rest is not laziness, but preparation. Pressure to constantly advance dissolves into patience, allowing effort to align with timing rather than ego. There is emotional danger in misusing this idea. Cyclical time can become an excuse for stagnation, a justification for avoiding responsibility. Patterns repeat whether growth occurs or not. The cycle does not guarantee improvement. Awareness does. This worldview invites humility. Individual lives are moments within vast repetitions. This can feel insignificant or comforting. Suffering loses its uniqueness, but so does ego. Cyclical time teaches that meaning is not found in escaping repetition, but in how one participates when familiar moments return, armed with memory, choice, and a chance to respond differently each time. Sacred geography. Sacred geography is the ancient belief that certain places carry concentrated meaning, power, and memory. It assumes that land is not neutral, that locations absorb human experience and become charged through ritual, history, and belief. Mountains, rivers, temples, crossroads, and cities are not just physical spaces, but psychological anchors where the invisible feels closer to the visible. This concept emerges from the human need to root meaning in the physical world. Abstract ideas fade, but places endure. Sacred geography turns landscape into narrative, allowing people to walk through memory, myth, and identity. To stand in a sacred place is to feel connected to something older than the self, something that existed before you arrived and will remain after you leave. Emotionally, sacred geography explains why certain locations feel heavy, calming, or unsettling without clear reason. Trauma, devotion, sacrifice, and celebration leave emotional residue. The body responds instinctively, even when the mind lacks context. This is why people seek pilgrimage, return to ancestral land, or feel drawn to places tied to personal turning points. Sacred geography also organizes belonging. To know where you are from is to know who you are. Exile is devastating not only because of loss of safety, but because it severs the link between identity and place. When land is reduced to property or resource alone, people experience disorientation and detachment. Psychologically, sacred geography stabilizes meaning. It externalizes values, making them tangible. Instead of existing only in belief, they exist in stone, soil, and horizon. Rituals performed in these spaces feel more real because the environment participates. Living with sacred geography means recognizing that environments shape inner life. Places influence behavior, memory, and emotion. When meaning is grounded in land, it becomes harder to forget, easier to revisit, and impossible to fully escape. Food taboos. Food taboos are the ancient rules that determine what is permitted to be consumed and what must be refused, not for survival alone, but for meaning. They turn eating into a moral act, linking the body to identity, belief, and belonging. What enters the body is treated as a reflection of who a person is and where they stand within a community. At its core, food taboos explain how culture disciplines desire. Hunger is universal, but permission is not. By restricting certain foods, societies teach self-control, obedience, and loyalty without constant enforcement. Refusal becomes a visible signal of alignment. To break a food taboo is not merely to eat differently, but to threaten shared boundaries. Emotionally, food taboos create comfort and tension at the same time. They offer certainty in a world of abundance by simplifying choice, yet they also generate guilt and anxiety around consumption. Desire clashes with identity, and eating becomes charged with emotion rather than instinct. This is why transgressing a food taboo often feels heavier than the act itself warrants. Food taboos also function as social filters. Shared restrictions strengthen group cohesion, while difference marks outsiders. Meals become rituals of belonging. Inclusion and exclusion are quietly reinforced through everyday behavior, long before ideology is discussed. Beyond tradition, food taboos reveal the human need to sacralize the ordinary. Eating is repeated daily, so it becomes a powerful site for meaning. By attaching values to consumption, societies embed morality into the body itself. Even when belief systems fade, food rules persist, resurfacing as dietary identities, moral eating, or purity narratives that continue to shape how people judge themselves and others at the most basic level. Mythic time. Mythic time is the ancient perception that certain moments exist outside ordinary chronology. It is not measured by clocks or calendars, but by significance. In mythic time, events do not simply happen once and pass. They remain alive, recurring whenever they are remembered, retold, or reenacted. A story from the past is not distant. It is happening again, now, through meaning. Emotionally, mythic time explains why some experiences feel timeless. Initiations, losses, revelations, and transformations often feel detached from ordinary flow, as if time slowed or disappeared. Mythic time gives structure to these moments, framing them as crossings rather than interruptions. They are not accidents, but thresholds. This concept also reveals why rituals matter. Repetition is not redundancy, it is re-entry. When a ritual is performed, participants step into a story that transcends individual lifespan. This creates continuity and belonging. Personal suffering feels less isolating when it echoes something ancient and shared. Mythic time blurs past, present, and future. Archetypal events repeat through different lives and eras, wearing new faces but carrying the same emotional weight. Betrayal, sacrifice, exile, and return are not historical episodes. They are patterns that reappear whenever conditions align. This repetition gives coherence to chaos. There is danger in living entirely within mythic time. When symbolic meaning overrides concrete reality, responsibility can be avoided. People may justify harm by claiming to act out a sacred story. Myth becomes an excuse rather than a guide, yet mythic time persists because it answers a deep psychological need. Linear time explains sequence. Mythic time explains significance. It transforms random experience into narrative, allowing humans to endure suffering by placing it within a story that feels larger than the moment. In mythic time, meaning does not fade with age, and the past remains active, shaping the present through memory, symbol, and repetition. The World Tree. The World Tree is the ancient image of reality as a single living structure where everything is connected across levels of existence. Its roots reach into the unseen depths, its trunk stands in the present world, and its branches stretch toward the heavens. Nothing exists in isolation within this image. Every action, no matter how small, sends vibration through the entire system. This concept speaks to the human intuition that life is layered. What happens on the surface is supported by hidden foundations. Choices made in the visible world are influenced by forces beneath awareness, history, instinct, memory, and myth. At the same time, individual actions shape future possibilities, just as branches influence the direction of growth. Emotionally, the World Tree confronts loneliness. It challenges the feeling of separation by framing existence as interdependence rather than isolation. Suffering is no longer purely personal. It is part of a larger web. This does not erase pain, but it contextualizes it, reducing the sense of meaninglessness that often accompanies hardship. The World Tree also implies responsibility. If everything is connected, neglect at one level destabilizes others. Ignoring roots weakens branches. Overreaching upward without grounding leads to collapse. Growth must be balanced vertically and horizontally, honoring both origin and expansion. Psychologically, the World Tree provides orientation. It explains why people seek ancestry, purpose, and transcendence simultaneously. Identity lives between what came before and what reaches beyond. When one level is denied, the whole structure feels unstable. Living with the World Tree means recognizing that actions echo beyond immediate consequences. Personal growth is not separate from collective stability. To tend your roots is to strengthen the whole. To harm the system is to harm yourself, even if the damage is delayed and invisible. Techne. Techne is the ancient understanding that skill is a form of knowledge made visible through action. It is not abstract theory or passive understanding, but the intelligence of doing. Techne exists where thought meets material, where ideas are tested against reality and refined through practice. It values mastery earned through repetition rather than insight claimed through explanation. At its core, Techne explains why competence commands respect more reliably than words. Knowing how to act in a real situation carries a different weight than knowing what should be done in theory. Techne is embodied knowledge, stored in hands, eyes, and timing rather than in language alone. This is why true skill often feels intuitive to the practitioner and difficult to explain to others. Emotionally, Techne creates confidence grounded in reality. The person who possesses it does not need constant validation because their ability reveals itself under pressure. Mistakes become information rather than failure. Each attempt sharpens perception, and each correction deepens understanding. This process builds quiet pride without arrogance. Techne also demands humility. Reality offers immediate feedback, and it cannot be argued with. Materials resist, systems fail, and results expose gaps in understanding. Skill grows only when the practitioner accepts correction and submits to the constraints of the craft. There is no shortcut that bypasses engagement. In a world obsessed with speed and abstraction, Techne reminds us that mastery takes time. Automation, shortcuts, and surface-level knowledge can imitate competence but cannot replace it. When Techne is present, work carries integrity, actions align with outcomes, and effort produces reliability. Without it, systems become fragile, dependent on appearances rather than substance, and collapse when theory is finally forced to meet reality.
Patron deities.
Patron deities are the ancient expression of humanity's need to anchor identity, protection, and purpose within a focused symbol of power. Rather than relating to the divine as an abstract whole, people align themselves with specific forces tied to professions, cities, traits, or life paths. The patron was not distant. It was personal, invested, and watchful. Emotionally, patron deities address vulnerability. When life feels unpredictable, attaching oneself to a protective force offers reassurance. Skill feels guided rather than accidental. Success feels earned but also sanctioned. Failure becomes meaningful rather than random. The patron transforms uncertainty into relationship, replacing isolation with perceived support. This concept also structures responsibility. To claim a patron is to accept expectations. Certain behaviors are honored, others are forbidden. Identity becomes specialized. A warrior, artist, healer, or ruler does not merely perform a role, but embodies it. Patronage sharpens focus, reinforcing discipline through devotion. There is psychological danger in this arrangement. When identity fuses too tightly with a patron, individuality narrows. One becomes a function rather than a person. Questioning the role feels like betrayal. Growth stalls when loyalty overrides self-examination. Patron deities also explain modern attachment to symbols of guidance. People still seek external forces to legitimize ambition, from institutions to ideologies to mentors. The language has changed, but the emotional structure remains. Humans want to feel chosen, protected, and aligned with something greater than chance. At its core, patronage reveals a desire for coherence. Life feels more bearable when effort appears witnessed and direction feels endorsed. Whether literal or symbolic, patron deities externalize inner values, turning abstract aspiration into relationship and giving people a sense that their path is not invisible, but seen and supported by something beyond themselves. Folk wisdom. Folk wisdom is the knowledge that survives not because it is written down, but because it works. It is shaped through repetition, error, survival, and memory, passed quietly from one generation to the next through stories, sayings, habits, and cautionary tales. Folk wisdom does not claim perfection or universality. It claims usefulness in real life. This concept emerges from lived experience rather than theory. It is born in kitchens, fields, workshops, and hardships, refined by consequence rather than debate. Folk wisdom often sounds simple, even crude, but beneath that simplicity lies compression. Complex truths are distilled into phrases short enough to remember when stress erases abstraction. What endures is what protects. Emotionally, folk wisdom carries trust. It feels grounded because it has been tested by people who paid the cost of being wrong. There is comfort in knowing that someone else has already failed, learned, and left behind a warning. This is why folk wisdom often feels conservative. It favors caution over novelty, patterns over exceptions, because survival rewards reliability more than brilliance. Folk wisdom also resists arrogance. It reminds people that intelligence alone does not outpace reality. You can ignore advice, but you cannot ignore consequences. This gives folk wisdom a quiet authority. It does not argue, it waits. When mistakes repeat, its truth reveals itself without explanation. Psychologically, folk wisdom provides orientation when institutions feel distant or untrustworthy. It fills the gap between official knowledge and lived reality. In moments of uncertainty, people return to it instinctively because it speaks the language of experience rather than theory. Living by folk wisdom means valuing what endures over what impresses. It asks you to listen not only to experts, but to patterns etched into human memory. What survives generation after generation usually does so for a reason, even if that reason is only fully understood after it is ignored. Ritualized violence. Ritualized violence is the ancient practice of containing aggression within structured, symbolic forms. It emerges from the recognition that violence cannot be erased from human nature, only directed. Rather than allowing chaos to erupt unpredictably, societies create controlled outlets where force is expressed, witnessed, and limited by rules. At its core, ritualized violence explains why combat sports, duels, executions, and ceremonial punishments have appeared across cultures. These acts are not merely about harm, they are about regulation. By framing violence as ritual, societies transform raw aggression into something predictable, socially sanctioned, and finite. The ritual sets boundaries where instinct would otherwise overflow. Emotionally, ritualized violence releases pressure. Fear, anger, and rivalry are given form rather than suppressed. When aggression is denied entirely, it festers and resurfaces in distorted ways. Ritual gives people permission to confront brutality without letting it dissolve social order. The violence is terrifying, but it is also contained, which paradoxically makes it stabilizing. Ritualized violence also reinforces hierarchy and belonging. Those who perform it represent authority. Those who witness it are reminded of boundaries. Participation or exclusion becomes meaningful. The act communicates power, consequence, and unity more viscerally than language ever could. This concept reveals an uncomfortable truth. Peace is often maintained not by eliminating violence, but by managing it. When rituals disappear without replacing the function they served, aggression does not vanish. It decentralizes, becoming random, invisible, and harder to confront. Ritualized violence shows that civilization is not the absence of force, but its domestication. When the structure collapses, the instinct remains, waiting for another outlet to give it form. Divine witness. Divine witness is the ancient belief that nothing truly goes unseen. It is the idea that actions, intentions, and inner states are observed by a higher presence, even when no human eye is watching. This perception transforms behavior by introducing accountability beyond law, reputation, or immediate consequence. The watcher is not merely external, it is internalized. Emotionally, divine witness addresses the fear of meaninglessness. When suffering or integrity appears unnoticed, the belief in a witness restores significance. Endurance feels recorded, restraint feels justified, injustice feels temporary rather than absolute. The idea that someone sees anchors morality when social systems fail. This concept also explains why guilt persists in isolation. When no one else knows, the sense of being seen does not disappear. Divine witness becomes an inner gaze, shaping conscience. Shame and pride operate not only socially, but internally, guided by an imagined observer who cannot be deceived. There is emotional comfort in this belief, but also pressure. Constant observation can create anxiety, especially when perfection is expected. The watcher becomes harsh, and self-compassion erodes. Inner life turns into surveillance. This distortion replaces moral guidance with fear. Divine witness also exposes the difference between appearance and intention. Public compliance without inner alignment loses value under this gaze. What matters is not performance, but sincerity. This creates a more demanding ethics, where hidden actions carry weight equal to visible ones. The idea persists because humans struggle with moral isolation. Without witness, integrity feels fragile. Divine witness offers a stabilizing presence, reminding individuals that choices matter even in silence. When held gently, it supports ethical consistency. When held rigidly, it breeds self-policing and quiet dread. The power lies not in being watched, but in believing that meaning does not vanish when no one is looking. Apotheosis. Apotheosis is the ancient idea of a human being elevated beyond mortality into something divine, symbolic, or eternal. It represents the desire to transcend limitation, to become more than flesh, time, and decay. Apotheosis is not only about gods being made from humans, but about humans needing proof that extraordinary life can defeat ordinary death. This concept emerges from the fear of impermanence. If everything ends, then effort feels fragile. Apotheosis offers continuity through elevation. The individual becomes a symbol, remembered, worshipped, or mythologized so completely that death loses its finality. What mattered most is not survival of the body, but survival of meaning. Emotionally, apotheosis explains the hunger for legacy. People want their lives to count beyond their lifespan. Achievements, sacrifice, and exceptional suffering are transformed into immortality through story. This creates powerful motivation. To live greatly is to earn remembrance. To be forgotten is a second death. Apotheosis also exposes a dangerous temptation. When elevation becomes the goal, humanity is often sacrificed. Ordinary limits are rejected, empathy is thinned, and suffering is justified in the name of greatness. Leaders and heroes may begin to see themselves as exempt from moral restraint, believing their destiny outweighs others' lives. Psychologically, apotheosis reveals the tension between humility and aspiration. The same force that drives innovation and courage can also produce arrogance and detachment. When someone is placed too high, they stop being seen clearly. Symbols replace reality. Living within the idea of apotheosis means navigating the desire to transcend without losing grounding. It asks whether immortality is found through domination or contribution, through being worshipped or through being useful. The myth persists because it answers a real fear, but it also warns that becoming larger than life often requires leaving ordinary life behind. The veil. The veil is the ancient idea that reality is only partially accessible to human perception. It suggests that what people experience as the world is a surface shaped by senses, language, culture, and belief, while deeper layers remain hidden. The veil exists not to deceive, but to limit, protecting the mind from what it cannot fully process at once. At its core, the veil explains why certainty is fragile. No matter how confident someone feels, their understanding is filtered. Assumptions replace facts, symbols replace truth, and stories replace complexity. The veil is what allows people to function without being overwhelmed, but it also creates illusions that feel solid until they are challenged. Emotionally, the veil generates both comfort and anxiety. It offers stability by simplifying reality, yet it also provokes unease because something is always missing. People sense that there is more than what is visible, more than what is said. This tension drives curiosity, spirituality, philosophy, and the hunger for revelation. The veil also explains conflict. Different groups perceive reality through different filters and mistake those filters for truth itself. When the veil is mistaken for the world, disagreement feels like threat rather than difference. People defend perception as if it were fact, because losing it feels like losing orientation. Moments when the veil thins are often unsettling. Crisis, grief, beauty, or deep insight can rupture normal perception, revealing how provisional everyday reality is. These moments feel profound because they expose depth beneath routine. The danger lies in believing the veil can be fully removed. Total exposure would dissolve meaning and coherence. The veil is not an enemy to destroy, but a boundary to recognize. Awareness of it creates humility, curiosity, and restraint, allowing people to question without collapsing under what they cannot fully know. Sacred speech. Sacred speech is the ancient belief that words do more than describe reality. They shape it. Speech is not neutral under this concept. It carries force, intention, and consequence. To speak is to act. Blessings, curses, oaths, and names are treated as events rather than sounds, capable of altering relationships, identity, and fate. Emotionally, sacred speech explains why words linger long after they are spoken. A single sentence can wound, elevate, bind, or free. Praise can stabilize a fragile sense of self. Condemnation can echo for decades. Sacred speech recognizes that language enters memory and reshapes inner landscapes, becoming part of how people see themselves and the world. This concept also imposes responsibility. If words create effects, careless speech becomes a form of harm. Silence gains power equal to expression. Speaking falsely is not merely inaccurate, it fractures trust and order. Oaths matter because they commit identity. Once spoken, the self is bound to the declaration. Sacred speech reveals why public language shapes reality. Laws, vows, titles, and declarations do not describe change, they enact it. To name something is to bring it into social existence. This is why naming carries emotional charge. Being named incorrectly feels like erasure. Being named truthfully feels like recognition. There is danger when sacred speech is exploited. When authority controls language, meaning can be manipulated. Words become weapons, severed from truth. Repetition replaces reality. In such cases, speech loses sanctity and becomes domination. Yet, sacred speech endures because humans intuitively feel its power. Even in modern contexts, people apologize to heal, promise to bind, and confess to transform. Sacred speech teaches restraint, reminding us that once released, words cannot be retrieved. They continue working long after the voice has gone quiet, shaping memory, trust, and identity in ways that are rarely reversible. Cosmic symmetry. Cosmic symmetry is the ancient belief that reality is structured around balance, proportion, and hidden fairness. It assumes that existence is not random, but arranged in patterns that repeat across scales in nature, morality, and fate. When things feel unjust or chaotic, cosmic symmetry promises that imbalance will eventually correct itself, even if the mechanism is unseen. This concept speaks to the human intolerance for meaninglessness. People can endure hardship more easily when they believe it fits into a larger order. Cosmic symmetry offers reassurance that excess creates consequences, arrogance invites correction, and virtue is not ultimately wasted. Even when justice fails locally, the universe itself is believed to remember. Emotionally, cosmic symmetry calms anxiety by framing suffering as temporary distortion rather than permanent chaos. It suggests that life bends but does not break, that actions echo outward and eventually return. This belief anchors patience, restraint, and moral endurance, especially in moments when immediate fairness is absent. Cosmic symmetry also shapes expectation. When people believe in balance, they interpret success as responsibility and failure as instruction. Fortune becomes fragile, something that must be handled carefully. This produces humility in victory and resilience in loss, because both are seen as part of a larger rhythm rather than final verdicts. Psychologically, cosmic symmetry explains why humans search for patterns even in randomness. We look for signs, parallels, and echoes because disorder feels unbearable. Symmetry reassures by making the world intelligible. It replaces the terror of arbitrariness with the comfort of structure. Living with cosmic symmetry means trusting that actions matter beyond immediate outcomes. It does not guarantee comfort, but it sustains coherence. When people abandon belief in balance entirely, cynicism grows. When they believe blindly, injustice is tolerated. Cosmic symmetry holds tension between faith and responsibility, insisting that order exists, but still requires human participation to remain visible. Moral luck. Moral luck is the unsettling idea that people are judged not only by their intentions, but by outcomes shaped by chance. It exposes the uncomfortable truth that morality is often assigned after results are known, even when the underlying choice was identical. Two people can make the same decision with the same intent, yet be seen as virtuous or blameworthy depending on how events unfold. At its core, moral luck reveals how fragile moral certainty is. Humans want to believe character alone determines judgment, but reality interferes. A reckless act that causes no harm is often forgiven, while the same act ending in disaster is condemned. This inconsistency is not accidental. It reflects how deeply outcome influences perception, even when logic resists it. Emotionally, moral luck generates anxiety because it undermines control. It suggests that a person's moral identity can hinge on factors outside their awareness or power. This creates a quiet fear of being defined by accidents rather than intentions. It also fuels harsh self-judgment as people replay moments wondering how close they came to being someone else entirely. Moral luck also shapes empathy and cruelty. Those spared by fortune are praised for wisdom, while those struck by misfortune are blamed for failure. Success is moralized and suffering is treated as evidence of flaw. This allows people to protect their sense of safety by believing outcomes are deserved. The concept forces confrontation with humility. If chance plays a role in moral standing, then judgment must soften. Awareness of moral luck does not erase responsibility, but it complicates condemnation. It reveals that much of what separates the innocent from the guilty is not virtue alone, but timing, randomness, and circumstance, quietly shaping lives in ways no one fully earns or avoids. Exile. Exile is the ancient experience of being severed from place, people, and identity at the same time. It is not merely physical removal, but psychological displacement. To be exiled is to lose the context that once made life intelligible. Language, customs, and recognition vanish, leaving the individual to confront themselves without the mirror of belonging. Emotionally, exile carries a unique grief. It is the loss of the familiar without the closure of death. Home still exists, but access does not. This creates longing mixed with shame, anger, and confusion. The exile is forced to remember constantly while being unable to return. Memory becomes both refuge and torment. Exile also exposes how identity depends on environment. Roles that once defined worth dissolve when removed from their social frame. Skills lose relevance. Status evaporates. This disintegration can feel annihilating, but it also strips away illusions. Without inherited roles, the self becomes painfully visible. There is danger in exile hardening into bitterness. When loss becomes identity, growth stalls. The world is viewed through grievance, and adaptation feels like betrayal. Yet, exile also carries transformative potential. Displacement forces reinvention. Survival requires learning, humility, and resilience. The exile becomes multilingual, psychologically if not linguistically. This concept also persists symbolically. People experience exile within their own societies, families, or selves. Rejection, cancellation, and alienation recreate its emotional structure. Even without crossing borders, one can feel unmoored. Exile teaches that belonging is not guaranteed but constructed. When stripped of place, the individual must decide what remains essential. Meaning is rebuilt from fragments. Though exile wounds deeply, it can also sharpen awareness, revealing that identity is not only inherited but forged under pressure in the space between what was lost and what must now be created. Sacred silence. Sacred silence is the ancient recognition that not all meaning is carried by words. It treats silence not as absence, but as presence, a space where attention sharpens and truth becomes audible. In many traditions, silence is where the sacred enters, because noise distracts the mind and language limits what can be known. This concept arises from the understanding that constant expression weakens depth. When everything is spoken, nothing is held. Sacred silence creates containment. It restrains impulse, allowing emotion and thought to settle instead of spill. What remains after silence is not confusion, but clarity shaped by restraint. Emotionally, sacred silence confronts discomfort. People fear silence because it removes distraction. In quiet, unresolved thoughts surface, memories return, and inner tension becomes impossible to ignore. Sacred silence does not soothe immediately. It exposes. Yet this exposure is what allows integration. What is faced in silence loses its power to dominate unconsciously. Sacred silence also establishes boundaries. Not everything deserves explanation, defense, or performance. Silence protects inner life from erosion by constant reaction. It creates dignity by refusing to turn every experience into spectacle. This restraint generates gravity, making words more potent when they are finally spoken. Psychologically, sacred silence restores authority to the inner voice. In the absence of external noise, perception sharpens, intuition strengthens, decision-making becomes less reactive and more deliberate. Silence teaches patience, attention, and the ability to endure presence without stimulation. Living with sacred silence means resisting the urge to fill every gap. It honors pauses, listening, and stillness as active forces rather than weaknesses. When silence is treated as sacred, communication deepens rather than diminishes. Meaning condenses. What remains unspoken carries weight, and the mind learns that not everything valuable needs to be announced to exist.